a rather hectic day. We have had a few things that we have had to change on our agenda, and so I just wanted to make note of that and make sure that we kind of understand. Our agenda has very short topical line items or topics descriptions. So we are going to, I don't think I have the latest copy of the agenda. Do I have dog tethering as our first item on the agenda?
Yes.
Okay, so dog tethering provisions, we're going to get a report from the staff, and then we're going to have a discussion around circus animals regulations, and we are not going to hear from the Brook Hill development developer because this is just an error on procedure and process. We do not hear from all of the developers submitting requests to the Housing Trust Fund until the staff has reviewed those trust fund applications. And so that was an error, jumping ahead of the game. So we will not hear from the Brook Hill people until after they submit their proposal for review. Last week, we had the city clerk's report on boards and commissions that we ran out of time, and the clerk will present that, and comments will be there. We have an item for rule clarification around the Citizens Review Board bylaws, and the city attorney is going to help us with that. The city manager is going to update us with our annual strategy, meeting summary, and the next steps. Committee reports will follow in the order that they're listed generally. And then later on, I'll have an announcement about our governance committee that's going to look at council's rules and regulations as well as redistricting after the 2020 census. So with that, I just want to start off. We will ask the manager to introduce the first item of dog tethering and see where we're going next with that. Sorry.
Thank you, Mayor and members of council. So tonight we have Marie Harris, who provided you with a staff report on both dog tethering provisions and circus animal regulations at the end of last year. We had an opportunity to provide that to you at the last strategy session, but no deep discussion. So Marie will do two things tonight. One is go over the report, but also there have been a series of questions since that report. I believe some of those questions have been, many of those have been answered and passed back to you. But the goal of this presentation is to bring you up to speed with some of the findings as well as level setting with some of the questions that have been asked. So Mayor, if that's fine with you, we'll turn it over to Marie.
All right, Marie, thank you.
Thanks, and good evening, Mayor and Council. And as the manager said, this is based on follow-up information from your November strategy session. And first off, at your November strategy session, there were some discussions around what types of provisions do we have overall for animals and to care for animals. And so we wanted to make sure, and in the report, we attached the full Chapter 3 of our city code, animals, and within that, if you want to reference your packet in front of you, the tethering report, if you reference page 23, it goes over some of our provisions in place to prevent animal abuse. Now, this is for overall, and we called out a few of those here for you on the slide. You must have adequate food and water, adequate shelter, protect animals from extremes of weather, heat, cold, and rain, sufficient shade. Shelter must allow them to remain dry and comfortable during inclement weather. And that's just a few of them that are pulled out. Those are overall animal provision protections we have in the current ordinance. Now, specific to tethering, so in September of 2010, Council updated the animal ordinance provisions around tethering to put specific criteria in place. And those were voted on in September and implemented March 1st, 2011. And the current provisions include adequate food, shelter, and water. The tether must be a minimum of 10 feet long. It must have a swivel on both ends. It must be made of a metal chain or coated steel cable. It must provide the animal unobstructed range of motion without the possibility of being entangled or injured. The dog has to be at least 4 months old to be tethered. and the tether may weigh no more than 10% of the dog's body weight, and it must be attached to the dog with either a buckle-style harness or collar and never used with a choke or pinch collar. You can only attach one dog to a single tether, and the tether must maintain that the dog does not go within 5 feet of any property line. So those are the current ordinance pieces in place. And when we were part of our review of the current ordinance, sorry, I didn't advance the slide. We were benchmarking with some of our peer cities, and just as a reminder, our peer cities are selected based on socioeconomic and demographic criteria similar to the city of Charlotte. We have a city engineer, Dr. Tazafor, who ran statistical analysis and how they clustered most closely to us, and that's how we have these 20 peer cities that you're familiar with. We typically benchmark services with. And of our national peer cities, is tethering allowed? 7 do not allow tethering at all. 13 allow it with certain criteria in place. And we also benchmarked some of our North Carolina cities, and of those, 3 do not allow it at all, and 2 have specific regulations in place around its use. And just more detail around our peer cities. Again, there's 7 that do not allow unattended tethering at all, and 2 of those are due to a state law in California, a statewide ban on tethering. Within the 13 that do, we try to help you by calling out some of the specific criteria that must be in place for tethering, as far as the length of the tether, the time tethering is allowed, the weight of the tether, how the tether is worn or attached to the animal, if the dog must be spayed or neutered to be tethered, if there's a provision that an adult must be at home, any weather criteria, and other accommodations such, and when we say accommodations, that's like food, shelter, and water that are required. It's specifically in some of the ordinances. And then based on our review, we're recommended to keep the current ordinance with the safety provisions in place. We don't recommend at this time banning tethering based on equity concerns or unintended consequences such as additional dogs having to surrender to shelters or less homes available for dogs, or potential unintended consequences of financial impacts to citizens. So again, for your consideration tonight.
Please let us get through the presentation. This meeting is only as effective as we can hear and discuss, and we can't discuss what we can't hear. And we can't hear what we can't. Thank you.
So again, for your consideration tonight, you can maintain the existing ordinance and educate the public on existing regulations and criteria. Another option could be look at hours of the day a dog is allowed to be tethered. And for this one, we want to be real clear. When we say hours a day, we mean like some say you can't after 11, between like 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., those types of hours of the day versus amount of time. When we talk to other health, animal care professionals across the nation, the ones they said it's really not feasible if you only say it can only be 5 hours or a certain amount of time. It's not really feasible to enforce. So, and last, consider a ban on tethering and establish parameters allowing specific instances where tethering is allowable. And what we mean there is some places where it's banned, they say it's banned, but you can tether your dog if you're working, if it's working, or if it's hunting, or if you're camping, or for temporary relief, those types of criteria. And thank you with that. I don't know if you want to discuss or you have further questions for me.
Any questions, Mr. Newton?
Well, I'd be interested in starting the discussion on this. Marie, thank you so much for your hard work here. I'd sent an email about 3 weeks ago in response to the report and asking for some additional clarification. And the reason why I did that is because I think it's important that we really drill down on the issue being presented by stakeholders here. And certainly there are jurisdictions throughout the country, peer cities, that ban dog tethering altogether, and everyone else has restrictions upon tethering. But I think what we're overlooking, and I'm glad that we have that chart that I think was created after some questions were raised by council. But what we're really talking about here, and I think the issue presented by stakeholders, is whether or not there will be unattended dog tethering for an indefinite period of time. And let me just break that down. So that is a restriction in its own right, but it's a restriction that we don't have and others certainly do. So to the extent that there's banning, to the extent that there's dog tethering that's allowable so long as there is someone attending to the animal, that's something that we are an exception to the general rule. And in that last chart, and I think this is what's important to note, when you kind of break it down, and we had sifted through all this information here over the past 3 weeks, what you'll see is that the greater majority of our peer cities, 13 and arguably 14, including Minneapolis, the greater majority at the very least, so when there isn't a ban, at the very least they say that if you're going to tether a dog, you have to attend, you have to supervise that animal. And that's because there are scientifically empirical data that shows that when you don't do that, certainly it's inhumane to the animal, but it poses a public safety risk at the same time. I think that, and then, just kind of further underscoring the point here, we have received information that I don't think is within our presentation here tonight, but we had received information whereby 4 of the 5 benchmark cities in the state of North Carolina, 3 of them have a ban. The other one also places a time restriction on unattended, once again, unattended dog tethering. And so that would be 4 out of 5. I think given those numbers, we're certainly behind the curve. I know that we've had a conversation about the equity aspect of this. And I would submit to my colleagues the consideration, so outside the context of a complete ban, at least the consideration of us saying that it's important and that we're going to insist that that animals and dogs in particular on tether be attended to or supervised. And I think that under the circumstances, from an equity standpoint, that doesn't eliminate the ability to dog tether at all. What it says is that if you're going to do it, you need to be responsible. And you need to be responsible certainly to the health, welfare, humaneness of the animal, but also to the community at large. We had a young lady not too long ago that was attacked by a dog that got off its tether. This is not uncommon. We've seen this in other counties, and the injuries are horrific. And we have the opportunity to not address this on the back end, right, through the extent of ordinances we may have in case, a dog is no longer on leash, but to address this on the front end and make sure that it's just prevented from happening altogether. So I think we can also drill down on the idea of punishment as well. And what constitutes adequate punishment from an equity standpoint, but I don't think that should prevent us from making sure that we do the right thing and put the language in place to prevent indefinite unattended dog tethering altogether. We can also have the conversation too as to whether we're talking about an extended period of time here. So it's my understanding that there are many jurisdictions that impose 3-hour periods of time where you have to at least supervise the animal every 3 hours. I understand that that's something that might be a little difficult, right, to keep track of, but we do it in a number of other ordinances that we institute, and we don't say that simply because it's difficult that we shouldn't make sure that we're doing our jobs and ensure that the owners, right, of whatever instrumentality may be are responsible. One of the things that come to my mind is the idea of no parking, right? There are areas where we say, you're not allowed to park here over extended periods of time, right? And we still enforce that. So I think under these circumstances, it is enforceable, but to the extent I think we have concerns there, we can always look at blocks of time and say these are the periods of time where the hazards presented to the animal and to the community are greater. And if we can do that, then at the very least, I think, we're moving in the right direction and ensuring that we're doing our jobs. So having said all of that, I would ask that we move forward on this. I think part of the question here is how we do that. I hope that tonight we can give some direction to our staff whereby they can draft a proposed ordinance for us to consider at a future business meeting. Certainly a business meeting too, where we can get input from stakeholders of the community before we take a final vote. So with a public hearing. But I think under the circumstances, we should move forward, given all of the information here that we have, and ask for that, that ordinance draft to be worked on. So I would make a motion for us to move forward to do that.
We have a motion to direct staff to draft a proposed ordinance to be on a future agenda with a public hearing. Do I have a second?
I have a question.
A question? Yes,
Yes.
ma'am.
So I have a couple of questions.
Is the question to the motion or the presentation?
I guess maybe just for a point of clarification. So Mr. Newton, if you could just help me understand, so are you suggesting putting this as part of a public forum and get feedback?
So, if I may respond to that, I suggest we do this like we would any other item that we would be voting on. We would have, and the question here is whether it would come back to us beforehand or it would go straight to the the business agenda. But certainly we would have a draft that we could discuss, and then after public comment on that draft, so a public hearing. This could all happen, but, I think it's not uncommon for us to do this all at one time, so, the same evening. But we have public comment on that before a final vote's taken.
So
So
let me make sure that I've clarified what the ordinary thing, it would be on our policy agenda, it would be a numbered agenda item, and people could sign up to speak, and depending upon the number of speakers we have, we would either allow 2 minutes or 3 minutes.
So just to follow up on that, Madam Mayor, so are you proposing a change for a ban or one of these other options where there is a restriction on the hours or regulating the hours of the day? Because there are three options that's been provided by the staff. So I just want to be clear, as we are going to, we are giving clear instructions to our city manager. So I want to know, I want to make sure that if I'm supporting the motion, which one of these options we are moving forward with.
Yes, sir.
So I think the clear trend is a ban for, once again, for humane and public safety purposes. Having said that, I don't know if that's something that we as a council would support, but short of that, a time restriction that exists in the greater majority, certainly the vast majority of our benchmark cities in the state of North Carolina, the greater majority of cities throughout the United States, some time restriction within our ordinance. Now, the next question, of course, is what type of time restriction? Is that going to be one in, from the standpoint of scope, which is like, say, every 3 hours, or is it going to be one where we're looking at a block restriction? Once again, a question I think for us as a council to consider, assuming we move forward.
May I?
Can I follow up to that?
Yes.
So would you propose that your motion was to direct staff to draft a proposed ordinance, and would you like to see a ban and a time restriction, and the council discuss both and choose? Is that what you're proposing?
Yes, ma'am, I think that would be fantastic. And maybe what we do too is, and subject to insight from all of us here as a council, but maybe we consider with the time restriction, whether or not maybe a 3-hour period, or if it's better to have a block where we're talking maybe like peak hours, so something like, say, 9 p.m. to 5 or 6 a.m., something like that, where we can identify the periods where, kind of the humane aspect as well as the public safety aspect is heightened.
I have to get a motion. We have a motion, so I'm going to
Yes.
restate your motion. Direct staff to draft a proposed ordinance with either first with an option of a ban or a time restriction with a span of time of 3 hours? It's kind of like, is it cascading? I
So-
just want us to make sure, because the manager has made a recommendation. So if we're going to have something on the agenda, so it's clear what's on the agenda.
So I think there are two options available. What I have seen when I've looked at ordinances across the United States is I keep seeing that 3-hour period.
So that's
know?
what you would have.
That's something that I would be most supportive of. But I've also seen block periods, and I know that has been a question that's been raised as well.
No, but your motion, tell us what you want. And I know what you've seen a lot of information, so
Okay,
let's just make
okay,
sure.
so
First
two.
was a
Two.
ban
Two.
or an
Two
option
ban
with
and
a time
then 3-hour
restriction
period.
of 3-hour period. That is the motion. Now, Ms. Ashmira, did you have any further clarification?
Yes, so it's either ban or the regulation of hours. Is that correct, Mr. Newton? Either or.
A time restriction.
Okay.
How's that
So,
time restriction?
yeah, so I'm comfortable with that motion. Complete ban, I struggle with that a little bit, even though I'm a big believer in animal care and protection. But we have heard where there are residents that will have, a financial impact as a result of the ban. However, we all know that there's something needs to be done to protect animals. So I would be in favor of looking at regulating the hours, and I don't know what that looks like, whether it could be 3 hours or it could be some sort of sliding scale, but I second the motion of looking at it from the regulating the hours.
Well, he made a motion that says first a ban and then the regulation of a time restriction hours with a 3-hour period. So are you seconding that motion, or are you, I'm looking for,
Do you wanna-
it's got to be, well, I think you can have it, the manager can present 2 options on an agenda item. He's not recommending
same
this because
thing.
he's already made a recommendation. This would be from the council member saying, propose an ordinance that includes a ban and then a time restriction as a choice. So I'm just trying to figure out if Ms. Ashmira is seconding the motion. That's what I'm really looking
I
at.
think we're saying.
We're offering a substitute.
I think we are saying the same thing here.
Which
Because,
is- You just said you would not feel.
Yes, so there is in agenda item, there will be 2 options. The first one would be the ban, and the second one would be the regulating the
Mm-hmm. Okay.
hours.
So you've got a second to that?
Yes,
Thank
I'm
you, Barry.
seconding the motion, because I think we got to look at regulating the hours to ensure that we are addressing the animal care and protection, but at the same time, we are not putting too much burden on families where they can't afford to build a fence.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Mayor?
Wait a minute. So you've already had a chance to speak to your motion. You've got a second. All right? Mr. Graham?
I'd like to offer to substitute the motion.
Yes, Mr. Graham?
My motion would be to make no changes to the dog tethering ordinance in Charlotte and empower city staff to use communication channels, animal control, neighborhood service teams to create capabilities for our community to report tethering issues, connect them with existing nonprofit solutions, and gather data on tethering and monitor the ongoing effectiveness of our current ordinance.
We have, excuse me, really, we've heard, we listen to you very carefully every time that you sign up for a public forum. This is the time I would like for you to listen to the council members. I understand this is passionate for all of you, and I really appreciate that. But courtesy and respect is also something that we would like to have in this discussion, because I think we've given that to you, and please let us have that from you. All right, I have a motion from Mr. Graham. Do I have a second to that motion?
Second.
All right, we have a second to that, so that's a substitute motion. So the first motion by our rules would be the debate on the substitute motion. Is that correct, Mr. Mr. Baker? All right, we have we'll go ahead and does the motion maker wish to speak to it, and then we begin the open discussion.
Yes, Madam Mayor. I want to thank everybody for coming out this afternoon. I clearly understand the passion and the emotion you bring to this particular issue. Our job as a member of the city council, and certainly my job as a member of this council, is to look at the broader picture as well. I'm really concerned about the unintended consequences that the ordinance will bring to our community, especially those living in inner-city communities in which I represent. I'm very concerned that thus far, there's been no public hearing to hear from the other side. There are those who think differently from you do. I'm not saying that they're right and you're wrong and they're right, but it's just been a one-sided debate thus far. And so I'm really concerned that the other side hadn't had an opportunity to voice their opinion. And lastly, I'm really concerned about whether or not we can even enforce it. And I'm also concerned about the selective enforcement when we do. And so for those reasons, I believe it's really important that we kind of support the manager's decision, which is essentially bullet point number 1, to maintain what we're currently doing, but take a look at stats and figures and data and educate the community. And I want to make sure that we are not trying to put together a solution looking for a problem. And so I think giving the council some time and the staff time to really do some due diligence, data collecting, some grunt work, so that the council really can make an informed decision at the appropriate time. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Winston?
Question for the attorney. If we were to do, let's say, create an ordinance that said we ban tethering, would there be an automatic prescribed penalty for that, or will we have to describe what that penalty is?
There is likely a default penalty. I don't know if it's a $50 fine, but normally you would ascribe a specific penalty to it. And you could.
Council would ascribe a specific penalty. So could we face the situation if we were to consider an outright ban with no penalty?
I suppose you could do that. I don't know why you couldn't do that.
All right. I think I agree with much of what Mr. Graham said. I think there is a way, but I think there's a way once we get more information, when we get more data on what is happening where this issue can fit into some of our stated council priority areas. I think when we talk about tethered dogs, backyards, and people's homes and where people live and play, we're talking about building better neighborhoods. When we're talking about the effect that tethering and chains can have on the overall community safety, this is an issue of community safety. As we look at different approaches, as we ascribe to looking at ways that we can strengthen families in our city to prevent things from happening in the future, there is no doubt that pets are a part of families, family units, and family structures. And any way, if there is an opportunity to work with our community to strengthen families and hit all of those buckets, I think that is a good thing. But I don't think we know exactly what that means right now. So I think we should direct staff, whether that be animal care and control or housing and neighborhood services, to work with our community members who are energetic and moved to find community-wide solutions, and these other organizations to really identify and form prescriptive solutions to identify problem properties or places where this is happening. I don't think any of the solutions that we have up here are going to get the results that I think many in the community want if we do not have that type of continued collaboration. And I think staff and our citizens, when working together, can and will find some solutions that will give us the success that we want. Thank you.
Okay. So do I have any other speakers? So Mr. Newton and then Ms. Ajmira.
So I think, and responding to the substitute motion, I think we need something with teeth here. And unfortunately, I feel like this is very well-intentioned, substitute motion. You make a very great point. But you mentioned continuing the conversation. I think the motion would effectively end the conversation. We're not talking about additional information to come back. We're talking about a game plan that would actually, would codify absolutely nothing in ordinance, nothing that's otherwise enforceable or would prevent the issue that's been brought to our attention. At the same time, too, I think, you know, in every instance that we take a vote, we do the best we can to hear from everyone, right? But we need everyone to show up. The people who have shown up certainly, you know, have told us, frankly, they've told us they would like to see a ban. I think, you know, we're actually considering something short of that, but it's never stopped us before from taking something to a public hearing and a vote, at which point everyone can show up, right? Both sides of the issue can show up and speak before any final decision is made. Once again, that's what we routinely do, and it sounds like we're taking a departure, you know, under the substitute motion here, if that's, you know, if that's what is agreed to. I think that that we can actually, so given the substance of the substitute motion, given the substance of the original motion, we can actually do both. And Councilmember Winston just alluded to it. You know, if we're very, you know, cautious about moving forward because we feel like the penalty would be too severe or inequitable, we could still codify violations or our intent into our ordinance, and the penalty could be one whereby, particularly under the first or maybe even second instance of a violation, whereby there isn't any monetary consequence, but we work with the individual, and we do that, right, to prevent the harm from happening, once again, with teeth in our ordinances. And thereafter, right, if it continues, then, you know, maybe there's something that's monetarily involved, but we do both, is what I'm saying. And there are agencies, so to the councilman's point, there are agencies that allow, that will build free fencing, and that will help in that regard from the equitable standpoint. But I do think that the substitute motion would end the debate, end the conversation moving forward, and absolutely accomplish nothing with teeth within our ordinances to address the issue that has clearly been brought to our attention.
Mr. Winston would like to respond, but Ms. Ajmira was next. Is that okay for Mr. Winston to respond?
Go ahead.
All right, Mr. Winston?
I definitely hear your concerns, Mr. Newton, about this not coming back, but which is exactly why I suggest bundling it within these priority areas that we have ongoing work. If we say, for instance, building better neighborhoods, if we can identify that, you know, we are looking for ways to improve our neighborhoods. So if there are families out there that would rather not tether their animals, but they know that without that tether while they're at work, he would jump that fence. We have a community and that creates other potential dangers and potential negative impacts. Perhaps this is not something that we have looked at in the past, but this is something that we can collaborate with neighborhoods, collaborate with service providers to work on fencing in homes like this, and by default, improve the overall quality of the neighborhood. That falls into line. As we take a more evidence-based approach to dealing with community safety issues, we are saying that strengthening families and other things that we haven't even thought about yet, perhaps like tethering of animals and dealing with animals in a community, can affect the overall community safety. So if we put it in these buckets that we're already working on and tell staff, we expect you to consider this as we're thinking about these overall things that are already coming back to us, I think that's going to ensure that we will we will have to deal with this in the future as we're coming up with the overall plans, again, to build better neighborhoods, deal with community safety, and strengthen families overall.
Ms. Hashmira?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I wanted to address some of the concerns that my colleague, Mr. Graham, had raised. I agree with you in terms of we've only heard from one side so far throughout this discussion. But I think public hearing will give us an opportunity to hear from other sides. In terms of the enforcement, I would like to hear from our city manager. If we were to go with the second option in terms of regulating the hours, have we looked at how that would work from our enforcement perspective? What kind of additional resources we might need? If that's something we are already in position to doing?
Manager, if I may?
Sure.
Okay, thanks. So the proposal of the 3 hours would be very problematic. We wouldn't have resources necessarily to sit at someone's house for 3 hours or 4 hours. That's why we were saying it's really not enforceable when we talk to other people. Because, so if I go out there and your dog's tethered and I wait a while and come back and say, well, it's been out there, they're like, no, I brought it in for 3, so there's a lot of problematic issues with trying, not saying it's too hard, but it's just really, legally, you can't hardly enforce it if it's a chunk of specific hours. Whereas if you're not supposed to do it between 10 o'clock and 6 o'clock a.m. or whatever the hours are, if I go out there and a dog's tethered, then you're in violation, and we can actually enforce that.
Right.
So we'd continue to deal with complaints as they come, as we do now.
I understand that regulating 3 hours or 2 hours could be a challenge when it comes to enforcement, but maybe having specific hours would address Mr. Graham's concern around the enforcement and how that could potentially be enforced. So I think I'm open to that option as well. From our 311 department, has there been data collected and how many calls we get on this, and can it be shared with council before our next meeting?
Yes, Councilmember Ashmere, I do believe in the report we
Yes,
had
ma'am.
the number of calls per year.
Yes, and I'm trying to, see what page it's on.
Page 7, I believe. Tethering complaints.
If you look at the tethering report in front of you, on page 7, so it's 3 years worth. Well, not quite 3 years, because when we pulled it in 2019, it was on December 3rd, so that one wasn't a full year.
So I see that in Table 3, I see the number of complaints when it comes to cruelty has gone up significantly from 30 to 49 to 60 in 3 years. And that's a concern to me, what kind of city do we want to be when it comes to animal care? So I think this information, it's sufficient enough for me, the data is sufficient for me to move forward. At least we got to do something. Doing nothing is no longer an option. Clearly from the data, it shows that there are a number of, we are getting more complaints, especially cruelty related. So I think that addresses some of the concerns that my colleague, Mr. Graham, had raised around public hearing, enforcement, how the data has been collected. So this is pretty comprehensive. Thank you.
Mr. Jones, would you respond to the complaint and how they're resolved for cruelty and as well as for the type of restraint?
Right. Yeah, so in the report, there's also the important note that a clarification of guard dogs versus dogs. And the other thing that as we go through this, and specifically for Councilmember Ashmere, we look at this as it is being reported. And I think the question is really the second box, table 4, that while the complaints are being logged, whether they're citations or warnings, and I think that's what I'm hearing tonight a bit, is that how can we use data to better inform decisions moving forward? So it is being captured, and I'll leave it at that.
All right, so, Mr. Driggs?
Just as a matter of interest, do we have any idea how many dogs there are in Charlotte?
No, sorry, we don't.
Be part of the census issue. I asked that only because,
We can talk about two-legged and four-legged dogs. I mean, that's one way. Okay, sorry, that was not appropriate, was it? I was just thinking about some friends. Okay, I'm sorry. Mr. Driggs?
I just wanted to say I'm coming down with, on the side that Councilmember Graham recommended. And I wanted to point out here, for one, your energy and passion about this has definitely raised the profile of this issue for us. And I think as we move forward, there will be a much greater awareness that this is something for which we are accountable. The concern I have right now is that if there are 100 of these complaints, there are many, many dog owners out there. You know, who knows how many dogs, 50,000 or 100,000. I think it just, as a matter of numbers, it's very easily possible that the adverse consequences for a lot of people who own dogs and care for them and care about them would be out of proportion to the actual instance of at least the complaints that are filed with us. So I think what I would like us to do is, for one, be more intentional about the data that we're looking at as we consider this. We have other planning things that we're doing in our comprehensive plan. It would be interesting, for example, to see comparisons between the cities that have tethering ordinances and those that don't, as to the incidence of dogs getting violent, because that was one of the suggestions, and get a better understanding. But I think the point we're trying to make is there are actually two sides to this. It isn't as completely open and shut. So whereas none of us here wants to see an animal suffer, and I think I want to emphasize that, there's nobody here that's indifferent to the suffering of an animal, we have to try and look at it in a broader context. So I will support Mr. Graham's motion. Thank you.
All right, so, Mr. Newton, I'm going to give you the last word on this motion before we take a vote.
So I look at page 7, and what sticks out to me is that over the past 3 years, you've had 331 complaints that are restraint related, and you've only had 2 of those result in any sort of action actually taken. And I look at that and I say clearly the data suggests to us that there is a need for some sort of mechanism here to address these complaints. And I think assuming we look at that and we appreciate the risk. Were you able to get that in the minutes? Because I actually have my speaker off there. But assuming, and I hope everybody heard me, but assuming we can appreciate that risk, much like we appreciate other risks whereby enforcement isn't straightforward or easy, I think, we need to act. I would make, so I appreciate the comments of my colleagues. I appreciate your comments and substitute motion, Councilmember Graham. But I would make a substitute motion to the substitute motion.
You can't, I think, you cannot, you have to vote on the substitute before you vote on anything. But I want to, may I say something if you're?
So just to conclude quickly, I think nothing prevents us from instituting the mechanism that we clearly know we should do given the data. Once again, 331 complaints, only 2 have resulted in any action taken.
May I make a clarification? Just like, to your point, yes, not a fine, but yes, we always go out there and educate them, and usually once they find out how, not everybody knows what's exactly required, and that's why we usually try to educate people and bring them into compliance versus fine them. So we do actually take action, just not fines.
Okay,
I-
well, I mean, I don't see that, you know, clarified in the data, and at the same time, I think what we have seen is a very heightened number of restraint-related complaints. I don't know how many of those are repeat complaints either, and I can only assume that this is going to continue to happen. And this is where we actually, you know, codify something within ordinance to address the problem. And I would ask, I think that under the circumstances, we can certainly do that. We can do that in an effective manner. And at the same time, we can incorporate the substitute motion within the penalties to ensure that it's done equitably on the back end, where we have that process in place to work with the animal owner, and then also hold them accountable, because I don't know if we have any of that if they were to continue to engage in what's considered inhumane, public safety risk actions, the types of things, and I think this was also brought up, the types of things that are specifically addressed in our charter and fall within our purview and responsibility as council members.
I really want to make sure that we're clear, because we've taken two charts and tried to make sure that they are related in somehow, but I want to read the words in between the two charts that say, all complaints are investigated. Over the 3-year period, 11 tethering warnings and 2 citations were issued. The continuous goal of animal control is to first seek compliance of ordinance through education and communication, which is something we seek in every effort. Instead of penalizing people, we try to say, how can we get this you get this to a place that's actually you're being a good dog owner. When targeted education and communication efforts are not successful, then enforcement measures. So to me, I want to compliment animal control for 171 education opportunities. All but 7 resulted in compliance. And that means that we have really worked with our community leaders and dog owners to ensure that they understand what's important, which is the welfare and safety of the animals. So I want to make sure that when we look at those two charts, that we connect it in a way that is a result of what you folks do, and I want to say thank you for what you do. So the next thing, we have a substitute motion. All in favor of the substitute motion, please raise your hand. All opposed to the substitute motion, please raise your hand. The motion carries. Thanks very much. The next item on our agenda is the circus animal regulations. Who's presenting on that, Mr. Jones?
Marie Harris again.
Ms. Marie, you get to do the circus animal regulations now.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. And again, as the city manager made reference at the beginning of the meeting, this is another topic that was brought forward in a public forum, and you discussed back in your November strategy session and received a report January 3rd. And tonight, we'd like to go over some of that information for you and discuss, give you discussion points for next steps. And first, at November, you had some conversation around what may qualify as exotic animals. And currently, again, this is in our city code, Chapter 3, Animals. We currently have a specific definition in place. Exotic animals are typically ones that you would find confined in a zoo, in the wilderness, that aren't native to North America, that could be seen to cause fear of bodily harm or significant damage to property. Our definition currently specifically calls out that that wild and exotic do not include household pets, farm animals, fish contained in aquariums, insects, and birds. So we do have a specific definition already in place to cover that. And as far as current regulations in place, the most predominant one is at the federal level through the Animal Welfare Act, and that's governed by the United States Department of Agriculture. And if you reference in your, this is the circus report packet, if you look at page 11, it lists their standards And that's the minimum standards, they say, but we pulled out a couple on the slide, just specific to some of the concerns we've been discussing. One, handling of all animals shall not cause harm or stress. Physical abuse shall not be used to work the animal or train the animal or otherwise handle the animal. And again, that's just a few of the provisions, but if you reference page 11 in your, the circus report section has more full details. And then at the state level, the state has provisions in place to prevent animal cruelty. They define cruelty. The state defines cruelty as every act of omission or neglect whereby unjustifiable physical pain, suffering, or death is caused or permitted. And the state further grants the authority to cities to put further regulations in place to further prevent inhumane treatment of animals. It also grants the city authority to regulate dangerous animals. Now, at the city level, as we kind of discussed in the tethering, we have certain provisions overall for animal abuse, to prevent animal abuse within our existing ordinance, but specific to wild and exotic animals, we have the definition, we have specific restraint requirements in our ordinance for wild and exotic animals, and we have provisions on who can actually keep and maintain these animals. But other than that, we don't currently have any specific provisions in place specific to the wild and exotic animals. And again, I won't go over this, but that we use the same peer cities. So when we looked at our peer cities and to see what kind of regulations they had in place for circus animal performances, 13 didn't have any, 4 had some regulations in place, and 3 put bans on wild animal performances, wild or exotic animal performances. And then we looked at some of our North Carolina cities. 1 had no provisions, 2 had regulations in place, and 2 actually had a ban on them. And one aspect that several of our peer cities had, and then other cities across the nation are looking at doing, is banning the use of bull hooks. And a bull hook is usually a wooden staff with a metal point and a hook on the end. And the recommendation, based on the fact that this is, after our review, we don't really, as a city, have a big financial impact or administrative burden. It's more so a policy decision for us to get direction from council on. And some options for your consideration: continue with protections as provided with the Animal Welfare Act, consider provision banning the use of bull hooks, consider provision banning the use of wild and exotic animals in circuses.
All right, any questions for the staff on the report? If there are not questions, do I have a motion? Mr. Mitchell?
Mayor, Council, thank you. I'd like to make a motion along with one of the staff recommendation is A, continue the current protection of the Animal Welfare Act, and let's follow Texas and consider banning use of the bull hooks.
Second.
We have a motion and a second, so I'm going to restate that on the council agenda, a future council agenda, that the manager would have a recommendation that, working under current provisions, we would recommend, or the council would like or an ordinance developed that would ban the use of bull hooks.
Yes.
So we have a motion and a second. Any discussion of the motion? Would the motion maker like to make a statement before we begin the open discussion?
Brevity is our friend tonight.
All right, thank you. Mr. Newton?
So, wanted to start by saying that motion is something that it's my understanding would place this in consistency or in line with a majority of jurisdictions, particularly in the state of North Carolina, and then also across the United States. My concern here, and certainly I think it's something too that addresses the concerns and the issues that we've heard from stakeholders, particularly as they pertain to humaneness, And I think we also know, too, is something that's not going to affect, right, the ability of circuses to exist, or zoos, or any sort of other types of entertainment that we might otherwise be interested in, like, say, dog shows. Having said that, my concern is whether or not it incorporates or is extensive enough to incorporate the wide range of wide-ranging types of instrumentalities used for inhumane purposes, such as electric shock treatment and other, so simply shovels and rakes, right? Poking at animals and creating the types of harms that we want to prevent, the aggressiveness and the potential for health and safety risk. So having said that, I'm very supportive. I would ask for a substitute motion that would also include additional types of instrumentalities such as electric shock rods and anything else that could be used in an inhumane fashion to harm or hurt an animal and also lead to the type of risk, the health and safety risk of our citizens. So that's a substitute motion to kind of expand the idea beyond just bullhooks.
So, Mr. Eggleston?
Just that I'm supportive of banning bullhooks. I think expanding it could be merited too. I just would ask our legal department and Marie and whoever else, if that's something that, and I know Mr. Newton gave a couple of examples, but I think if we could see if there are other cities that have language that it's expanding the use of certain instruments beyond bullhooks, that we could get those examples or that explicit list of what those things are in advance of the public hearing that would be held before the vote, so that folks, I think the more clarity we can provide in advance of the vote of what the vote is exactly on, the better people are going to be able to speak directly to the motion.
I think that's an excellent point, because the state regulation says the terms cruelty and cruel treatment include every act, omission, or neglect whereby unjustifiable physical pain, suffering, or death is caused or permitted. So it seems to me like electric shock would fall under state regulations, but I don't know that. And so the question would be to find out what the state defines as those things, because I don't know if there are parameters already in place there. All right, so we have any further discussion of the motion? So it would be to place this,
I did substitute, I don't know, and so the substitute motion was to expand it
we have
beyond
a
just bullhooks.
substitute motion?
Yes.
Second it, assuming we can get some clarity from staff.
Wait a minute, the substitute motion was, please state it again.
So the substitute motion is to expand the original motion beyond just bullhooks to include any other type of instrumentality that could be used in a fashion, in a cruel, unusual fashion to the animals.
Would you accept that to the original motion, or would you have it as a separate motion?
I think keep it as a separate motion. The mayor,
Okay, so it's a substitute motion.
My interpretation is covered under the state, but, so if we can use it as a separate motion.
And I would say included but not limited to, electrical shock, et cetera.
How about we say?
Given the clarification.
How about we say, I mean, again, this is being brought back to us next Monday for a public hearing and for a vote.
I didn't say next Monday.
Oh, sorry, at a future business meeting for a vote and a discussion and a public hearing. So what if we were to say, I mean, we're essentially asking staff to bring back language. So what if the language was, we're asking them to bring back a provision banning the use of harmful instruments, including but not limited to bullhooks. They can come back with the exact language of what that is and isn't, or what's covered by the state laws and what's not, and then we leave it at that and let them come back with more information.
And I second that.
Okay, let's just say, we have a substitute motion that expands, I think it's called anything that causes
Anything inhumane and
inhumane treatment.
inhumane treatment and harm.
So that's different than bullhooks,
Yeah.
and so it's a substitute motion. Are you seconding the substitute motion? We have a substitute motion.
Mayor, could I ask for a clarification?
Yes.
Is the substitute motion just to instruct the legal department and staff to come back to us with a proposal? Is that what we are now?
It's centered around the use of certain tools or
Right,
instruments.
but we're now
Yes.
voting on having a follow-up where we get more information and clearer, like text, draft text and clear definitions. So we're not
An
deciding the
ordinance.
issue tonight. We are,
We are not deciding the issue, but it would be
yeah.
on your agenda, I'm going to say, so that everybody can hear me, February 24th. We would have citizens come down and speak, and it would be the expanded definition of inhumane
all right.
instruments. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. So that is the substitute motion. Any other discussion? Okay, all in favor of the substitute motion, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, we have 6 to do that. February 24th, on the agenda, we will have the circus animal regulation, and we'll get that information out in advance so that we know what we're talking about.
Just a point of clarity.
Mr. Bakari.
I voted for it, but if we could also get staff to bring back, I have heard anecdotally that when you ban things like the bullhook, in essence, what you're doing is banning the ability for them to be here. So I don't know if that's true or not, but the whole point is, if that is true, one, I'd like to know, because it may just be we're banning circuses, and I don't think we should do so via the bullhook and not actually do it, if that's what our intent is.
We've got a great team of people here listening to this tonight from Animal Control. I think they'll be able to tell us what the result and impact of bullhooks are and for circus animals in their next report. Ms. Harris?
Thank you.
Fabulous work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, the next item on our agenda is the city clerk's, I'm sorry, we'll give you a couple of minutes to get out so you can go home. There's no Monday Night Football, guys. We solved that last night.
I'm on your side. I'm an animal lover. I'm on your side. I want to see a result. I want to see the outcome, the results that because we put language in it doesn't get us further from the results.
Am I using this? I can use what?
Well, that's what we got to figure out.
Right, but okay, this way.
It's not warm fuzzies, but if we're saying that it's a better option to treat
Okay.
the families that just don't know how to do it, don't have the time, whatever it may be. The solution is the solution they need is still.
Okay, let's not lose the flow of the agenda. Let's keep on going.
People in the audience leave, not council.
That's right, that is true, not council. Okay, thank you very much. The next item on our agenda is the city clerk's report for 2020 on boards and commissions. I just want to, thank you. I do want to say one thing before we listen to the clerk's report. I just have run out of time and energy today. We were focused a lot on this agenda, and my plan was to have, working with Julie, to have the Mayor Pro Tem, to have the assignment of the committees to the council committees, the boards and commissions to the council committees. It's just, I don't want to do something in haste. I want to do it so we're not having to redo it. So not getting to it today, we will get it to you this week, okay? You still will have 11 months to get those reports in and back and out to the committee. All right, we've lost a few people, so we'll just keep on going. All right, Ms. Clerk, or I'm sorry, Ms. Kelly, Madam Clerk, Ms. Kelly, please. This is your annual report to the council on our 2020 boards and commissions.
Thank you, Mayor and Council, for the opportunity to provide you with a brief update on boards and commissions. Tonight, I just want to briefly touch on these 3 items. Some new changes that have been implemented for boards and commissions. I want to give a brief overview of the application and nomination process, particularly in light of the fact that we have 3 freshman council members, and this will be coming up next month, next week, actually. This presentation was prepared in January, so it says a look ahead to February, but it's actually a look ahead to next week, next week's council meeting. At your retreat, you received the first compilation of the annual reports. And so one of the things that's implemented new in 2020 is the use of the annual report template. And so all of the boards and commissions were asked to complete this template, and so that it would allow council to get a snapshot, just a picture view, 1 page or 2, of what the various boards and commissions were doing. And the use of the templates was successful in that 85% of all the boards and commissions submitted this and used this template. Another thing that will be new for you this year will be the use of demographic information that will be provided to you when you receive your nomination ballots. You will be able to see the breakdown of the actual, each individual board, and it will show the ethnicity of each board. And also, one other thing that you will see this year is the members who did not meet attendance requirements for 2019 will be prohibited from participating in or serving on additional boards and commissions over the next 12 months. So okay, this is a list of the 37 boards and commissions, and inadvertently, the Charlotte Water Advisory Committee was left off of this, but Charlotte Water Advisory Committee is one of the 37, and it was inadvertently omitted from this slide. So coming up in February, was there a question?
Go back to the other one, the list.
Yes.
So in the yellow, I see airport advisory. What's the second column?
The Development Review Board. That was a board that was created by council in 2010, and it has never met. So it was created as a part of the planning process, and I think it was supposed to review petitions of some sort. I did print
Okay.
that information.
And the next one is Housing Authority Board of Charlotte-Mecklenburg?
That's the Housing Advisory Board. It is actually in transition.
To the county.
Yes, and
That is
so
the
you will be.
That is the 10-year plan to end homelessness committee.
Right, and you will get additional information about that board at a later update from Ms. Weidman.
It is still in the statutes. We got it through the Senate, and we're waiting on action by the House. I don't know if we'll get it in the short session or not, but we have requested, we've gotten the Senate approval, and it did get moved over to the House, and we're waiting to see if they will act in the short session.
So coming up at your meeting in next week will be nominations. And so the process is that the vacancy announcement has been advertised it was advertised for 4 weeks. Applications from anyone that was interested in being appointed or being reappointed, those applications were due on January the 26th. We have gone through the process of screening those applications, and you will receive those that are qualified based on staff review, that are qualified to be considered for those vacancies. And also this template, which you have seen and we used in 2019 as a part of the manager's recommendation for improvements to this process, this template is being used by many of the boards to make so that the chairpersons can make recommendations on persons they would like you to consider for appointment. And nominations will take place next Monday with appointments at the subsequent meeting on February the 24th. So this is the application, and applicants can apply or reapply online through our Granicus system. All board members that are appointed are required to meet at least 65% of all the regular meetings throughout the calendar year, or else they are removed at the end of the year. Members who seek a second term must have attended at least 75% of all regular, special, and subcommittee meetings. Board members may not serve on more than two boards, and also they cannot serve more than 2 consecutive terms. However, I will point out if an individual is appointed to a partial term, if they are appointed to fill a vacancy created by someone's resignation or because someone failed attendance, they can continue to fill that partial term and then 2 terms of their very own. So it's possible that they may serve a little more than 6 years if they meet attendance. And certain of your boards require candidates to have background checks, to also take oaths and/or submit statements of economic interest. So this is the applicant ballot that you will receive in your nominations packet. So the process is that City Council is informed of all vacancies. You review the position requirements and also the recommendations made by various chairpersons for those persons that they wish to recommend. On the ballot, incumbents are identified on the ballot, also out to the right of their name. And you will also find on there that their district is also included. And as I mentioned earlier, board demographics will also be provided for each individual board so that you can see the breakdown of the boards. So at the meeting on February 10th, you will get your ballots on Thursday when you're in your packets. And then at the dinner meeting the action review meeting, you will be asked to submit your ballot to the clerk, and we will tally those during the remainder of the meeting. So when we go to the chamber, that's where the nominations will actually either, if someone has received more than 6 nominations, you can appoint them by acclamation, and it requires a motion, a second, and a vote by council. And if there are 2 nominations for any one person, they will be on the ballot for appointments at the subsequent meeting. We do not read out the names of nominees at the meeting, so you will get that information from the clerk's office in an email on Tuesday morning. You'll receive an email that lists all of the nominees that were not appointed by acclamation the previous night. And so that is basically the process in a nutshell, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And also, I think provided to you in the yellow folder, especially for our newbies, are the copy of the ballot, so you'll know what you will get in your packet next week. And as always, we're available to answer any questions. You can give me a call or email me, and I'll be happy to walk you through the process or to answer any questions you may have.
All right, are there any questions for the clerk? Mr. Newton?
Stephanie, thank you so much for this information. I don't know if you might have already covered this, but do we have any exceptions to the general rule of non-attendance, so missing a meeting? It came to my attention recently that there was a gentleman who missed a couple of meetings because he had cancer, and they conflicted with his cancer, with his cancer treatments. And there wasn't any sort of exception maybe in place to give or to excuse that. Is that accurate, or do we have any any circumstances where those types of exceptions exist?
Mr. Newton, we don't have any rule that allows staff to make exceptions to attendance, but what has happened previously in several instances where persons have had illness or, extenuating circumstances, they just need to let the staff advisor know, preferably in writing, and we convey that information either to the city council or to the mayor or whoever is the appointing entity. And there have been exceptions made under such circumstances. And what we tell people is if they have a work conflict, that's not an extenuating circumstance. But illness, major, life happens, and the mayor and council are well aware of that, and we just ask that they provide us that information so that we can provide it to who needs to know. And we have many instances where the council has reinstated someone.
Any other questions? I have a couple of things that I'd like to ask the council to think about. There are a few boards that are really focused on personnel-related issues. The three that I think about are kind of quasi-judicial boards, perhaps Citizens Review Board, the Civil Service Board, Community Relations Board. And right now, we advertised every quarter for those vacancies. And I wanted to just bring up on the Citizens Review Board, you have to go to the Citizens Academy before you can even be considered for that board. I don't know the syncing between Citizens Academy and creating the quarterly announcement. So I was wondering if you could give us some ideas about how that works. Like, are we getting enough applications so that we have applications of a pool of people consistently available for that board? So what I'm really saying is, how do we manage the calendaring so that the Citizens Academy, which is a very intense and very long process, and I think they've done some things to make it more webinar-based and things like that. But not when you were there, that's true, but you're just an old graduate, right? Oh, gee. So if we can...
Mayor, I have an answer to that. We actually maintain a database of all of the graduates. As the class graduates, whoever is administering that program sends us a list of those persons that complete the academy, that have met all of the requirements. So we have a list of currently it might be about 300 names of people that have completed the academy. It might be a little more than that, but that have completed the academy since it began. So we do have a database of names and contact information from persons that have completed it, and when they finish, they are encouraged to go ahead and submit an application to us. So we have applications on file from some people that are interested.
Of the 300, how many applications do we have on file?
Now, that question I can't answer right off the top of my head.
I don't know why I somehow feel like it's like around 30 or maybe less
I think it's a little more than that.
with applications on file.
Yes.
And how long do their applications stay on file?
They're good for 12 months.
And so if you've been doing the Citizens Academy 3 years ago, you have to reapply or redo your application.
Right.
I think that we need to figure something out there. I think that to be eligible to be on that list that your application to come in, you have to renew it. But those people are very valuable to us to create a diverse pool of applicants. So I wonder if there might be some exception for if you've been in the Citizens Academy and you apply, you stay on the list 24 months. I just really feel like we get more people on board through that process. They've really invested, and 12 months may not be a sufficient amount of time to take advantage of that talent pool that we would have. So I'm not asking, I just like to understand it a little bit more, because when I've seen the list of eligible candidates, they don't usually number 300. And so it's a certain pool out of the 300 willing to apply, and if they don't apply in 12 months, then we don't get the benefit. And I just
Right.
wonder if we should look at it perhaps longer, and I'd like to see some ideas and suggestions from the Citizens Review Board. to the committee that they'll be working with and their annual meeting with the committee. And I had Mr. Driggs and then Mr. Eggleston and then Ms. Watlington.
I would mention the people that we're able to appoint from the nomination, from the applications that we get is actually a pretty small percentage. I mean, my sense is we get 30 to 50 applications and we're asked to name 2 or whatever. So it's already a highly selective process. But the other thing I would just comment on is if we did keep those over a longer term, I think we would need to at least communicate with the applicant and get them to reaffirm their desire to be in the pool for a year, because they could have moved away, or, we don't know. So it could be a simplified thing where we just say to them, okay, do you wish to remain in the applicant pool? But there should be some sort of acknowledgement from them that they're in it and want to stay in it. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Eggleston?
Similar, and I might have misheard what you said, but they don't necessarily have to apply within 12 months, but, I mean, once, I think Ms. Watlington's been through the Citizens Academy as well, we both have, that's good in perpetuity as your prerequisite for being on that board, and then it's just a matter of the applications are good for 12 months. So to
That's
Mr.
what
Driggs's
I'm
point,
talking
if there's but then it's as simple as reapplying. Maybe if there is either an automated way or if it were automated, we could apply it maybe across all boards, or if it's manual, maybe we target it to specific boards like CRB. But if we could essentially just ask people if they want to renew their application, or your application is now dormant, would you want to renew it? And if so, would you like to make any changes to the boards you're interested in, or any other prerequisites that you might have met in that time frame to make it easier for them and to prompt them to even realize that their application has gone dormant? But the bar is fairly low for someone to re-up if they know they need to.
Yes, and if, in the busy world of life today, I just wondered if we could kind of make sure our applicant pool remains diverse and full. And those are just ideas. I would really like to ask the Citizens Review Board to give you some ideas about what makes their membership work best. So, Ms. Watlington?
So 2 things. The first one is in regards to the Citizens Academy. I know that it's a requirement for the Citizens Review Board, but for the Civil Service Board, I noticed that it's not. So I was just curious as to why that is, because for all the reasons that you just named, I think it's important that we look to that pool of folks that have graduated from Citizens Academy as we think about hiring and performance management. So there's that piece. And then the second piece is, as you think about CLA, Civic Leadership Academy. Yeah. My question, because I know that part of the draw in the program is that the thought is that coming out of it, then that you would be sitting on a board or something, having made that investment into the community to understand how things work. So I'm just curious, how do we make that linkage as well? And do you already get a list of the graduates?
Well, actually, on the application, there is a question that says, have you completed CLA? And if you indicate that you have, then you put down when you finished. And also, as a part of the program, Lacey and whoever has replaced Lacey, I don't remember his name at the moment, but I usually try to go to the class and walk them through the process of applying, answer their questions about boards and attendance and meetings and anything that they have to ask about boards and commissions. I'm usually one of the last things they do on the last night of their class, so that is fresh in their minds. And many of our recent applications are from persons that have completed CLA, but they have an opportunity to note that on the application that they have completed it.
Just as a follow-up question, do we see that?
Yes, you do.
Thank you.
So on the difference between the Civil Service Board and the Citizens Review Board, I'd ask the attorney to give you that information. One's like really old. I mean, it's been around for a long time, and one's fairly new with new things. So, but if you'll describe the difference and get that to everyone, that would be helpful. Okay, anything else on,
Mayor, I just
clerks?
wanted to make
Yes,
one other
ma'am.
clarification. You were speaking about the quarterly advertisement for all of the boards. One of the things that we have implemented is the announcement that was posted and that you were given list all of the upcoming vacancies for the year. So you will be able to see what vacancies there are throughout the rest of, remainder of 2020 on that list.
Mr. Winston?
Just when we do finally get these boards and commissions aligned with committees. Do you envision that we on committees will be able to work with the clerk's office, work with those on those specific boards and committees to, I don't know, come up with paradigms that might reach the goals the best if we run into some of these issues that have been pointed out around, you know, retaining talent, providing continuity, timely reporting? Do you think we'll have that autonomy to create practices specifically to those, between those two relationships?
My understanding is that each board has to submit an annual report. Those annual reports would go to the committee, the council committee, and there'd be an opportunity for discussion there. And I think that we don't have right now any boundary for that. So I think that let's try and see what happens. And, you know, if it gets to be a burdensome process to either group, then that's a consideration. But if it turns out to be very productive, then we can build on it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Kelly. All right, the next item on our agenda is an update on the Citizens Review Board bylaws, and Mr. Baker is going to help us understand what we have to, what we've been asked to think about, and then decide which agenda we would go on next, at our next council meeting, which is what, the 9th? 10th. Yeah, 10th. Sorry, I keep losing a day. Okay, Mr. Baker?
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. I was contacted by the attorney for the Citizen Review Board about an issue that they're having, and it relates to the topic that we just discussed about membership in a commission, and in particular, the juxtaposition between the attendance policy and a particular piece of the procedures for the Citizen Review Board that speaks to their membership. And specifically, the issue is that board members charged with a felony, Class A1 misdemeanor, a Class or Class 2 misdemeanor during a term of office shall be automatically suspended until disposition of the charge, and a quorum shall be established from the remaining membership. That is in the ordinance that created, part of the ordinance that created your Citizen Review Board, but there is not clarity as to whether that suspension preventing someone from attending a board meeting should count on their absences for purposes of attendance. So if you've got a felony, and we actually have a live situation here where someone is not allowed to attend any of the meetings because of the felony suspension rule, for want of a better term, and whether or not the attendance policy should be told during this process or whether it should be applied during the process. The specific request of me is to apply the attendance policy to the individual, even if they're suspended. And my recommendation would be, well, first, I wanted to make sure that this is where council wanted to go with in that regard. And I think if that's the case, then there should be some clarity in that process. Rather than just make the assumption, we should just go ahead and bridge that gap, which would essentially have me bring back to you at the appropriate time, but I've already essentially got it written out. If you wanted to go in that direction, it would read something to the effect of, a board member of the Citizen Review Board who fails to attend a regular or special meeting of the board because he or she is suspended pursuant to Charlotte Code 1656-D, that's the code that I mentioned, will be considered absent from the meeting for purposes of applying the City of Charlotte's attendance policy for city board members as set forth in Resolution Book 49, page 327. That includes the 3 consecutive meetings policy. So it would clearly be applicable. And when you have missed, please correct me if I'm wrong, Madam Clerk, when you have missed 3 consecutive meetings, you are automatically removed from the board.
And may be reappointed at the discretion of the council for any board. I think that's the question that Mr. Newton asked. If you have cancer and you can't make it, then you have the same attendance requirements, and then you're eligible for reappointment.
Correct.
All right, I have any questions? I have, let's see, Mr. Bakari?
Just clarification, is in this scenario, is it a felony charge or a felony conviction?
Felony charge.
And so I don't know which route you're going with it, but if it becomes a felony conviction, I'm assuming, given that role, that they are no longer able to hold that position. Is that correct?
That's a separate piece, yes. Because individuals with felony convictions are prevented, are not eligible to be on the board.
So what you're saying here, right, what you're saying here is if somebody is in a felony conviction, or a felony charge period, and they miss their days, but in the end, they're exonerated or whatever, and there's no conviction, should we be able to allow them back on?
You could allow them back on if you wanted to.
But you're saying automatically change it so that doesn't trigger allowing them back on it. I'm just trying to make sure I understand, like.
I'm sorry, it's the exact opposite, actually.
Okay.
What I've been asked to do is to bring forth, this is from the board itself, a recommendation that if you are suspended from the board because you have been charged with a felony, and that suspension prevents you from making 3 consecutive meetings, then you are automatically removed from the board due to the attendance policy, not the felony suspension rule, if that makes sense. I lost you there at the end, didn't I?
I was almost with you until that very end.
So-
Okay.
So I think it's being consistent with all of our boards. If you miss, and as Mr. Newton said, you can, if you have a real issue that you cannot attend, then the attendance policy generally will applies. But that means after you come back, you can be reappointed. So I have assumed that what Mr. Baker is saying is that if you're found not guilty of something, then you can come back and be reappointed.
That all made sense to me. The part I think I got lost was if you are put on suspension by the body.
So you are automatically put on suspension.
By the body.
Yeah, through the ordinance that you have.
Right
Yes.
up.
It's the ordinance that automatically suspends you. So if you're charged with a felony tomorrow, you are automatically suspended from the board. And then the issue has been that in the pendency of dealing with those charges, you then miss 3 meetings because you're not allowed to attend because the ordinance has suspended you from the board, whether the attendance policy should apply.
All right, Mr. Eggleston and then Mr. Driggs.
So I know this is in response to a specific situation of which I know a little about, and I think that we should probably move forward in that direction. I just wonder if in the spirit of having some level of innocence until guilt is proven, that if we should maybe have an automatic restoration of someone to a board upon the next vacancy or something, if they were to be found not guilty. Because if you get suspended for a charge, but you haven't been proven guilty, again, it's precluding work from being done on this board right now, which I think is why we need to take action. But if there's a situation where somebody is not guilty, found not guilty, then do we want to leave it up to the discretion of the council whether or not to reapprove them, or do we want to say they'd automatically fill the next vacancy on that board? No, I could probably live with either, but just as a possible slight alternative.
All right, Mr. Driggs.
It seems to me that you're innocent until proven guilty. And if you're prohibited from attending meetings by our policy, I don't see how that counts as an absence. So, I have trouble with the logic here. I think maybe we need a special provision for people who are accused of felonies, but kind of this mechanism through which their failure to attend meetings because they weren't allowed to causes them to be excluded doesn't make sense to me. So I would rather see us do something that says specifically, if you have a pending felony charge, you may not attend meetings, but that absence doesn't count. I just think that makes a lot more sense, because if you're subsequently found not guilty, then, you're innocent. And why there should be any penalty in terms of attendance because an erroneous or an unsustainable charge was brought against you doesn't make sense to me.
So just to clarify, that's essentially the position that we're taking right now. We, the city, that has been my interpretation of it, that if you wanted the suspension to somehow be trumped by the absentee or the attendance policy, then you should have said that in your ordinance, which is what you didn't do. And so they're asking to take the further step. But that has been our interpretation right now, is that the suspension continues on, but that those absences aren't mounting against this individual.
Because it's 3 in a year, is that right, that causes you to be?
3 consecutive.
3 consecutive.
And my understanding is that he has.
What's the
missed-
interval between those meetings? Is it monthly?
I think it's monthly.
They meet on an as-needed basis, but they have met regularly
Yeah.
in 2019.
Yeah.
All right, so I
Okay.
think that this ordinance was written by a couple of lawyers on the council. Tim, I can't remember Tim's last name now. Tim Sellers wrote this, and it was in part, this issue was raised because it was reviewing police matters, and you're under investigation, and that's why the whole thing came up. But the issue didn't come up that you shouldn't be able to serve. The issue was, how do you get the work done if everybody can't participate? And obviously, it's caused, this came from the board because they would see it as a need to get the work done. It's not about the position, because if they're found not guilty, then they can be reappointed. And I think Mr. Eggleston raised the other part. Do you want to automatically go back on, or do you want the council to appoint you? All right, Mr. Winston.
All right, thank you. Mr. Baker, were you ever, it's the prerogative of council to choose the people that serve on these boards and commissions, correct?
Either the council or the manager. The manager has some appointments.
Or the mayor's appointments?
Or the mayor, yes.
Now, in terms of removal, is it the same? Are we able to remove members from boards that, council specifically, by vote, are we able to remove people that we have appointed from those boards and commissions?
Yes, so there is a provision in your procedures, and again, Madam Clerk, correct me if I'm wrong, but they do serve at your pleasure and can be removed by the appointing body, whether it's the council, the mayor, or the manager, yes.
So just from what I've heard and what I know, I think there's a problem in our ordinance, obviously. It seems to me that one, innocent until proven guilty should be the standard that we all abide by. And those that are accused of felonies are still innocent until they are proven guilty. So they should be able to be served unless council has the prerogative that those shouldn't serve for whatever reason. So I think we need to go into the language of our ordinance and remove that triggering, this suspension that is triggered by this accusal, and put the onus back on us as a council to consider these appointments should the situation arise where we think we should be considering their removal.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay.
Do we need a
So,
motion here? What are we looking to do here? What are we looking to achieve at this?
the achievement was that we have a request from a board that we have under the rules that they have written into our ordinances. And they have requested that we clarify the rule, and that's going to be on the agenda at a future meeting. And I don't know whether it's the next one or the 20, it's either the 10th or the 24th.
So I would like to, ask staff, if we're going to consider anything, I would like to consider the ordinance without that language in there, and put it back on us to make those decisions to remove our appointees
I don't.
or suspend.
I think, Mr. Baker, you need to give us some history about whether this ordinance had state approval or just ours. There might be more process than just what we can do. So give us some background on it, because this was very controversial when it was done. And there were some reasons for it, maybe some information about it, who has to approve it and how it has to be done. So I think that if you can get that information out, then we have, I think, an obligation to that board to respond if we want to do something differently. And it's not for all boards, so it would just be the specific one. Is that what I'm hearing? Is the rule exists for, it doesn't exist for every board.
I don't think it does, no.
Three
It's just-
absences does, but.
Three absences
three
does, but
absences.
not the felony rule. The felony only applies, I think, to this one. That's what, so.
And this is in part because this board is directly reviewing Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department
Yes.
issues.
Right.
Could go both ways, though.
Well, it can, and I don't disagree with you. I'm just saying, let's get some information about it and go on. And then the other thing is Mr. Eggleston suggested automatic reinstatement or reappointment. So, Mr. Eggleston, and then we'll,
Yeah, just that, I think Mr. Winston could be onto something that we could make the decision. I think in this instance, I would assume, maybe end up at the conclusion that we should remove the person from the board. But I would wonder too, if this is being brought back with more information, one, should the felony rule apply to the other board that is involved with CMPD? And two, if we were to decide we were going to remove this person, there would have to be a presentation from staff as to the circumstances of their arrest and charging, and would that be considered something that we would do as a personnel matter in closed session, or would we just be airing our citizen volunteers' laundry in open session to decide whether or not they should be removed?
I think my review of the ordinance is much simpler than that. It would be simply, were you charged with a felony? That's the triggering mechanism here, is that you were charged with a felony, which this individual was, then the circumstances I haven't gotten into, because the ordinance just makes clear that if you're charged with a felony, you are automatically suspended.
I guess I just mean if we're considering Mr. Winston's idea, then we would need to have we would then need to know more about each specific case to make the specific decision. And if that is something staff brings back as a recommendation, we'd need to know how that would be handled.
Sure.
and the question is it universal or is it applicable to this board? So let's get some information and see where we go, okay? The next item on the agenda is the council annual strategy meeting summary, and Mr. Jones.
Well, thank you, Mayor and members of council. I'll attempt to be fast with this. It's really coming back to the council, lessons learned from the 2018 annual strategy meeting versus the 2019. We're in the 2018 annual strategy meeting. We had a series of short, medium, and long-term items to address. And so what we'd like to do is, right out of the gate, give you information related to where we ended with the annual strategy meeting. So if we start with the summary of items, we had 115 items, and 84 of those items were identified through the 3 breakout sessions: the Great Neighborhoods, the Transportation Planning and Environment, and the Workforce and Business Development. If we go back in time, you may remember, I believe, January of 2018, when there were a number of questions that council had. I think we called it the 27 questions. Staff went back, talked with each one of you to make sure that we understood what is the question, and we came back with an issue, background, and next steps. So because we really didn't have an opportunity to do a closure at the annual strategy meeting, this is close to it, okay? And this is just step one. So of the 85 items, we've consolidated them into 57 items. And as you can see, some of these are just one word, like Brook Hill. So your council, your ACM, that's your liaison, will talk to you, because each one of you put an initial by these stickies and ask you, what did you mean by that? And what we really believe is, when it's all said and done, we really won't have 57 items. There will be something that's more consolidated. We're going to come back to you next month with what we would call those white papers that gives a bit of a elaboration of the question, as well as come back with you in April and try to make sure that those white papers, if you will, are in the right pot. So what do I mean by the right pots? Can we go back one? The other thing that's important is, much like affordable housing back in 2018, the council took a deep dive into mobility, accessibility, and connectivity. And there were 14 items that were short-term 10 items medium term and 7 items that are long term. And you have those also as a handout. I will tell you that we didn't go with easy to do, hard to do, because I think that was part of a little bit of the conflict during the annual strategy meeting. But the key is that they're all being reviewed. So if we go to the next, what we plan to do at the March strategy session is to provide you with white papers on each one of these items after speaking with you to make sure we've captured it. The April strategy session, after the discussion, we can see where these 88 follow-up items reside. Some may need to have a potential council action. Some will be just the manager's responsibility. Some will be existing initiatives or programs. Or you may find out that after we've talked with you, that you may suggest that, sticky number 17 was just a thought and you didn't expect a future action required. I will tell you that this is good for us. It's a lot of work, but it's good for us because it gives us an opportunity to make sure that we're talking with you to get the essence of what you were trying to get out of the retreat, but also everybody will get shared information in terms of a quick analysis, and you can tell us where you'd like to go from there. So that is where we are in terms of the follow-up from the retreat.
Any questions for the manager? I'm sorry, Mr. Winston, Ms. Watlington.
I just was curious about the parking lot. I know we had one, so I was just curious if what was captured in the parking lot was also captured.
The parking lot is in here also. Everything. Yeah, so everything's in, yes.
Mr. Winston?
Okay, so just to clarify, we have 2 different documents here, right? The short, medium, and long-term goals for mobility, accessibility, and connectivity. These are independent of this list of 57, or these might be cross-referenced into
I
this list of
think there's,
57 as well?
at the most is about 6 that are cross-referenced, but we always will stick to the mobility, accessibility, and connectivity because that was the driving force behind the retreat.
And so this list of short, medium, and long-term, obviously, council has not come to any conclusion on whether or not we're going to go about doing this. So how would you, how would you express this for
Right.
people that weren't in the room?
A great point. So if we start off with short-term, 6 months, item number 1, plan to connect all sidewalk gaps. So we would go back to the individual who had the question to make sure we've captured the right question. We'd have an issue statement. There would be some background information in terms of what we do with sidewalks and the funding and things of that nature, and potential next steps. So the most important meeting for the team would be actually the April meeting, because you would get feedback in March. And at the April strategy session, there's the opportunity to see whether or not, how much additional information you need on these areas. So the last thing we want to do is get to the 2021 annual strategy meeting and nothing has been done. So this is holding us accountable to keep this in front of council.
All right, so the point of doing this, taking this time, is to come up with an annual strategy for council, mayor, and city management staff.
2 years.
How will we define, at the conclusion of this, how are we going to define what our strategy is moving forward?
So Councilman Winston, if I understand you, I think there are 2 pieces. One is that there will be some metrics that would determine what is success. But also there are some things that we may have already initiated that really hasn't risen to this level. A lot of it's going to be the feedback that we get from you as we talk with you about this in March and April. The goal is, by the time we get to July, if we have something that's short-term, that we have some successes, or at least some of these may make their way into the FY 2021 budget.
copy, because it would be, the strategy would have to correlate to the budget year.
Exactly.
We've already set this. So the goal is to get something around July 1st.
Exactly.
All right, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Mr. Bakari?
Just two quick points. One, just to make sure that we don't earn too much staff time without, like, 'cause some of this is really valuable. I think some of it is duplicative and things like that. So I'm assuming the first step is, so if you came to me and said autonomous vehicles, right, and short and long term, and I think it's part, I'll tell you exactly what I meant by that and what I thought the workload was. When I look at some of these, like, connect sidewalks, plan connectivity for job centers, strategic mobility plan, adopt a policy that community-wide transportation system, my assumption is, like, a bunch of this is gonna consolidate down.
Absolutely. If we can go back one slide. While the team basically started to consolidate this down to a fraction of this, I said it's not fair to council, because council will say, well, what was on the cutting room floor? So everything is in here. There's no way they're going to be 57 items. It potentially is about half of that, because so many of these are related. I actually pulled out the
There
column.
might be 3 or 4 unique topics
Yeah.
in short-term items, but I think, I only make the point because I think all of us want to know where was the thing we said, and we can point to the sub-part of a plan.
Right.
But again, I'm also going to assume that a lot of these plans already exist, and this isn't net new white papers and stuff, right?
Absolutely.
And then selfishly, where's Providence Road and all this? Get back to my thing.
If it was on a postie, it's somewhere in here, okay?
It's in there somewhere.
Okay,
Great,
yes,
great,
okay.
thanks.
Hallelujah.
Yes, Ms. Watlington?
I want to make sure, and forgive me for asking another process question, but when we say we're going to come back after we've done this work and have a strategy, does that strategy then, I see goals that we worked on specifically for mobility, accessibility, and connectivity. Tell me if what I'm thinking is the correct expectation based on what you shared. What we're going to see in the next month or so is for each one of our 4 focus areas, these are the 3 goals, these are the specific action steps that we're going to take, and these are the metrics that we know we're red or green?
Yes. So where we were earlier was, I was going to provide you with a sheet that consolidated most of this. And again, I think I would have had more questions had I not put everything down there. Again, there will be 2 phases to this. One is the short, medium, and long term, and that was around mobility, accessibility, and connectivity. But the other 3 areas were really breakout groups in terms of great neighborhoods. And for instance, we know something that will come out of the great neighborhoods or healthy communities is going to be the violence reduction plan.
Right.
And that is going to capture so many items under that. And so that's where we feel comfortable that while we will have a bunch of white papers, a lot of that was going to be rolled up to maybe a dozen concepts that we can implement.
So let me,
I'll ask you Friday.
let me say, I think that one of the things that we do is we talk about major initiatives and key initiatives, and always we have one about being an effective and good government. But we can roll up great neighborhoods and safe communities, and we can have the transportation planning and environment and workforce and development. So I would assume that when I see this, and Marcus, this may be what I'm just kind of dreaming about, is that we have some major goals around how do we change so that we can have great and safe communities. And that those goals will have metrics, and they'll have initiatives underneath them that are funded for 2 years. That we wouldn't expect to go on the council retreat next year and start on a brand-new plan.
Right.
So it would actually be the idea, we talked a lot, 3 days, about these big buckets, and now how do we drive those big buckets down into initiatives that are funded with metrics, and how do they contribute to those large buckets?
Okay.
And I think that's where I kind of see the value in this. of having everything in here you get to see, because at some point, it's going to fit within a plan of action that's funded and will guide a lot of the work being done for the budget. So you should think, we should be thinking about our budget, and we have our first workshop Wednesday, is that correct? Wednesday. So when you look at this list, I look and think, well, what are we talking about in our budget that relates to those major buckets that we want to have?
Okay.
So I'm assuming we'll see a lot about neighborhoods and safety, and we'll see a lot about mobility. And so, does that make sense? That's the way I hope it works, anyway. Because, we have a lot of really talented people working here, and we want to be innovative. We want to encourage them to be creative and come back to us with the very best of what's cutting edge. So there's we think about these things, but I want to see that energy and innovation, because they're talking about it every day. I think some of us talk about it every day. Not all of us. Okay.
That's it.
All right, so now we're going to go to our committee updates, and I thought we would start first with budget and effectiveness. And I also wanted to see at your place, I've sent a referral to the Budget and Effectiveness Committee on our resolutions issue. And we've talked about this a good bit, and Patrick will be working with us on this, but it's kind of like how to address this issue so that we know what our plan is. Even if we decide to deviate from the plan, we at least know where we start. Okay. Now, Mr. Driggs.
Thank you, Mayor. I think we all received a document that had some notes from the various committees, so I'm just going to hit some highlights from budget and effectiveness. First of all, the members of the committee are, excuse me, I'm skipping here. Myself, Vice Chair Isolt, Dimple Edgemira, Malcolm Graham, and Renee Johnson. Our purpose is to review and recommend policies to ensure the city has a strong and sustainable financial plan and maintains operational efficiency and effectiveness. We've met twice since the last report out. Once was on January 2nd to give some council members an opportunity to look at the agenda for our retreat and provide input. We generally, I think, approved the agenda for the retreat and commented mainly about what sort of discussion should take place during the long period set aside for council conversation. And personal opinion, the retreat was a success, so I think that is good. On the 21st, we met and we covered a couple of topics. The Chief Financial Officer presented a plan on the city's expected future borrowing, and this is essentially a list of refinancings and other financings related to current activity and not new debt incurrence. You'll see some itemized descriptions in the report. We also heard about the financial 2019 audit by Cherry Beckert. There were 5 opinions expressed in the audit: financial statements, internal controls over financial reporting, federal single audit, state single audit, and passenger facility charges collected by the airport. We received clean opinions, unmodified opinions for each. There was one item that was highlighted as a material witness, which was an error concerning the closeout dates of capital projects and encumbrance status of certain contracts. Corrective action is going to be taken about that. We got an update on existing capital projects, which basically included a review of 178 projects that are currently ongoing with a total budget of $1.1 billion. Of those, 19 are completed since the previous update, 4 projects waiting on partners, and there were 8 with some budget risk. And I think this is the one item that maybe deserves council attention. So there are now 8 items that have some uncertainty about the budget surrounding them, and it looked like from the information we got, the magnitude of that could be something like $10 to $20 million in total. So I think the good news is it doesn't appear that there are any ticking time bombs out there, but we will see some fine-tuning on a number of budget items. Then we had a discussion about a workshop plan for our budget workshops. They will occur in February, March, and April. And essentially, the staff provided us with a bunch of topics that came out of the retreat and said, okay, how do we want to approach these during our budget meetings? And I think this is a good way to go about it because it aligns the budget conversation with the discussions we had at the retreat. And we suggested some priorities for each of the meetings in such a way that we feel that all of the important, most urgent decisions related to the budget will get covered early in those meetings, and that we should be able to get through the remaining items that we were required to pay attention to before the meetings are over. And that was essentially what happened in those meetings. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Are there any questions about
We
the
accept your
report?
report.
Very well stated.
What's that?
I said we accept your report.
Okay, my report has been accepted. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, remember, this is an opportunity to ask a question about something that you're concerned about as we're moving forward, or what you're hearing as some concerns is a feedback time. So, I mean, Ed, it's great to accept your report. I like to say it's always good to know that you review our audit findings. That's really an important part of what we need to do. Okay. All right, so the next committee is our Neighborhoods Committee. Great Neighborhoods, Mr. Graham.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The Great Neighborhoods Committee is comprised of my Vice Chairman, Braxton Winston, Tariq, Julie, and Victoria Wallington. We had one meeting thus far this year with a very special guest, Councilmember Johnson, and joined us as well. You see the purpose and the goals and objectives laid out for you of the committee. Our first committee was really an orientation session that we used to get the new members, including me and Victoria and Ms. Johnson, up to speed on some of the terms, housing policies, local, state, and federal funding sources, talked about the housing trust fund allocation process, summary of key housing programs, continuum of assistance from home ownership to homeless to home ownership. So it was a really, really good meeting orientation session where I told staff, and Pam Whiteman did a fantastic job in terms of presenting the information, working with council members collectively as a committee. And I know she's already met with a number of the committee members individually to make sure that all the new members are up to speed, ready to go in terms of the housing initiative. So we had a very, very good meeting because of her assistance and her knowledge base. You should know that the Housing Trust Fund proposal went out on January 17th. The due date is next Monday, February 10th. I think the mayor read my mind this morning in reference to Brook Hill and regarding the possible conflict of interest. A number of developers had called me saying, hey, I want to present too. And so I think it was a very good call to postpone.
Actually, Pam called me and told me, I didn't read your mind. I heard it from Pam. So
Okay.
you know, credit where credit's due.
Well,
Thank you, Greg.
Somebody's thinking about it, right?
You got it, because Malcolm and I talked about Brook Hill and the public relations stuff going on around it. And I just felt like we shouldn't be reading in the newspaper something, but at the same time, there is a competitive process. So I appreciate you reminding us.
Yeah, and so there was, the applications are due back on February 10th, and then it's game on. Certainly, we've all received information about Brook Hill. I took the opportunity also to visit it with Ms. Wyman and myself. The landowner should be ashamed. And I'll just leave it at that. There are a number of hurdles to be cleared, but obviously I can't speak for the committee or the council, but if you hadn't seen Brook Hill, you need to see it for yourself. That being said, there's a process that he, as well as others, have to clear, and so we'll be talking about that sooner than later. But the deadline for all the applications is February 10th. And on a personal note, I had the opportunity, Madam Mayor, to meet with just about every housing agency or organization over the last 2 months in terms of their willingness to work with the city, their understanding of the affordable houses crisis that we're facing, and their willingness to help the city. So took the opportunity to do some self-educating, and so We're just ready to get back to work. Our next meeting is February 19th, and we're ready to rock and roll.
Okay. Any questions about this? I think the housing application, the Housing Trust Fund application, given the funding, I know as much as we have money, it's still a limitation, particularly in the environment that we're in. And looking at the TEOD and what we're trying to do in encouraging the ability for housing on the rail line and the transit system is even more of a challenge, because if we can create opportunities for people not to have a car, it contributes to their income. So I think we've got a lot of criteria in the existing housing framework, but I want to make sure that we continuously update where we need to be related to some of the other initiatives that we're trying for, like our TOD work.
Madam Mayor, if I can say one other stuff I should have mentioned in reference to the housing partnership and the new complex that opened up. You saw the long lines. I want to thank Councilmember Johnson for kind of stepping in there as well and working with the housing partnership. I also attended a meeting with them that night with the community, and so I was there to kind of help them soften the blow. They admitted publicly that they had a bad day.
Yeah.
And, but that's no reflection on the organization at all.
Thank you for saying that, and thanks for sending out the note to all of us. My understanding is that they're going to refund the deposits that people, application fees that were made, and I think that's a very good sign of hearing and reacting quickly. So
It's just a visual presentation of the problem.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
I was just going to say, I worked with Councilwoman Watlington and Councilman Newton as well on that. So it was good. Yeah, it was a team approach and city staff, but it was a demonstration, a visual demonstration of the problem. It's very sad. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Let's see, who's up next? Safe Communities.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Our starting five is myself, Vice Chair James Smudgy Mitchell.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
Is
that for yourself?
He's cheering, yes.
I'm sorry.
You're supposed to hope other people cheer for you, not cheer for yourself.
It's okay.
You just woke me up, come on.
Councilwoman Ajamera, Johnson, and Watlington. So we met on January 22nd for our first meeting, which was to start the discussion around the framework that we were charged by the mayor with creating in terms of identifying what it is we want to measure, what the outcomes are that we're looking, what we want to measure to achieve the outcomes that we desire, the outcomes that we're hoping for. If you're looking at that sheet, you'll see at the bottom, violence reduction, healthier neighborhoods, increased access and awareness for youth and family programs and services, increased community capacity, increased employment. Obviously, violent reduction is a focus for the community. We think a lot of these other things are the things that will help us achieve that violence reduction. So identifying the things that we want to measure, there's some examples of those in there, everything from young people's ability to read at grade level to reducing the behavioral issues that we're seeing in schools. So a lot of this is preventative, proactive measures. We do obviously realize that there will be reactive measures in terms of law enforcement as well. But we're building on 4 main building blocks, but we also, there was a clear mandate. I forgot to mention our honorary 6th man on the team, Mr. Winston. And this was something he and others brought up on, in addition to the 4 building blocks of community collaborative approach in priority areas, implementing a violence interruption program, investing community-led efforts, and making sure that we're using evidence and data as best possible. There was also a clear consensus that we want to make sure that we are very explicitly stating our intention and desire to work hand in hand with the other organizations that share in this work and share in this task. And obviously, everyone from the county to the school board to the state public defender's office, district attorney, CMPD, sheriff's department, everyone is going to have to be working together to make sure that we're not being redundant in our efforts, but we're being complementary in our efforts, and that something one person is doing is not in conflict with another organization. So there was a kind of a steady drumbeat throughout the discussion about how we've got to make sure that this is a partnership, not 6 or 8 organizations operating independently. So you can read the rest of it. We want to benchmark against peer cities, as we do with a lot of things. We want an assessment of our current programs, and we want to identify opportunities where maybe some of those programs can be measured quantitatively or qualitatively in a way that we've not necessarily asked of them before. But we want to make sure that we're measuring the things that we're doing, the dollars that we're spending, so that if we are seeing successes, we can expand those programs. And if we are not seeing the return on investment that we want, maybe we shift away from things and try other new approaches. So I'm not going to read the whole sheet to you, but happy to entertain any questions. And I would encourage anybody who's interested to either attend or watch tomorrow at noon. We'll be down in CH14. And with the goal, we'll have a presentation from Gibby Harris, the Public Health Director for Mecklenburg County. We'll also have a goal in that meeting tomorrow of advancing the framework that we started work on January 22nd out of committee tomorrow to send to the full council. So, and there will be a nutritious and delicious lunch served. So I'd encourage you to attend in person.
All right, Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that y'all are going to work collaboratively, and I think everybody realizes how important that is. Who's setting the strategy, though? Who's convening that group that really needs to work together?
I think to some degree, Mr. Jones and I had a bit of that discussion today. I think to some degree, that's still in the works. I'll defer to you based on the conversation we had earlier today.
Sure, yes. So Mayor Pro Tem, I would say that there are 3 levels. One, we participated in last week, where you have the mayor pro tem, and the chair of the board and the vice chair, and the manager and I sitting down and talking about some things that we should be working on together. And then from a charge from the chair and the mayor, I guess it was in December, Dina and I are meeting with a group of folks, and now we have a calendar at that to have an ongoing meeting with the sheriff, the chief, and people at that level to discuss how we can collaborate with this process. And then there's a staff-to-staff component, and then there is elected-to-elected component.
Thank you.
Mr. Winston?
Might I suggest, I think I might have said this to you before, to the group before, we already have a table where all those folks are meeting, the CJAG. So instead of perhaps trying to recreate the wheel, we should take advantage of forums that already exist, and we just take a different approach to those forums that already exist.
I don't disagree. One of the things that was, I guess, very interesting for the county manager and I, it was just staff wanting to get the okay from the 2 of us to work together. And so we're taking some bigger steps in this collaboration. So I think it's important that Dina and I be involved at least until we can figure out what is this collaborative framework looking like.
I was suggesting you and Dina could be more involved in those tables that already exist.
All right, Mr. Graham?
Just one comment and then a question. The comment is in terms of those collaboration, those meetings, I don't expect them to be at all the meetings, but if there can be maybe a special one where we bring in grassroots leadership to kind of talk with you guys as well. Don't expect it to be every meeting, but certainly there may be 1 month where you want to bring in someone to sit around the table to kind of hear their perspective from the ground level.
And at least in one of those convenings, we were looking at the list on there, there is some community representation.
Yes.
Okay.
But I do think this is interesting. All of us have great relationships with a number of different types of people. And I have a good friend, served a lot of time, and he said, I want to be able to help you understand what's going on. I think all of us ought to be seeking that kind of understanding. And sometimes the only way to get it is with people that have experienced the system. And I would think that it would be worth a consideration, Mr. Jones, if we actually did have some folks that are doing this community work. A while back, God, it seems like 2 years, but a year ago, we actually had a meeting with a number of people that are active in, they've come through reentry and they want to help other people, and they were doing all kinds of work. It was really a good meeting because for the first time they had the ability to describe what their commitment was to this community. And I don't think we can do this work without their understanding and strength. So I would agree that it might be worth just having another, you can't talk about this enough. If we could actually work with a group that have gone through the system, come out, they've got reentry, and they're helping bring other people along.
And I think that their perspective will be valuable in every facet of what we do, but I think that they will be particularly critical as we look at this in implementing of a violence interruption program. Those are the exact type of people, I think, not solely, but I think those people fit squarely into the folks who have the credibility in the community to be able to be those violence interrupters that a police officer or an elected official or somebody might not always have.
Exactly.
And then my question, and I don't need an answer tonight, but it's for the Public Safety Committee, is in terms of when does something become a public nuisance and that we can take action on, i.e. in Renee's district, the hotels over there, we know it's a hot spot.
Mr. Baker,
We-
I've asked him that question, Mr. Graham.
I mean,
Actually, he was successful in Durham doing it.
I mean, I'm just using your district as an example because the hotels are there. We know there's
My district too, over there too.
Are you trying to answer it?
So there are,
He really doesn't.
I was giving him some time so he can think about it. So, but if you have an answer, I'm willing to listen.
it's not so much that I have an answer, but that data is being collected. It is a very heavily data-intensive pursuit, but it is something that's a very powerful tool that has been used here in Charlotte before, and we are looking to potentially do that again if the data supports that.
But also, we've had some of our abilities taken away, I think, in recent years in terms of the logs that had to be kept of customers and things of that nature. I think we've been pulled, some of those have been pulled back from us.
I would just hope that we can be proactive in pursuing that. Met with the chief last week, and, we need to make sure that they got the tools that they need. We want to do the wraparound service for sure, but if we know there's a problem consistently over and over and over and over again, at some point, the data should be there, and then it's time for some type of implementation.
And so I think, too, that part of what we're looking at when we're analyzing the programs that either exist in Charlotte, exist elsewhere, or that maybe don't exist, but we're considering, would be how can they be targeted at either a geographically specific areas where we've identified hotspots, i.e. the one you just referenced, or targeted to specific age groups or young men, things like that, that are the specific demographics that we've identified where there's most need. So I think in some instances, we might be looking at programs that have an eye towards a Sugar Creek 85, a Nations Fort, Arrowwood, those places that we've identified as the most challenged areas.
Any other questions here? Okay, then our next committee report is from TAPE.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the TAPE Committee, or whatever we're calling it today. TAPE?
TAPE? Oh.
Anyway. You met.
Do we have to have now the little accent when we type it up and send it?
We welcome recommendations on a new name for the committee.
Sounds like a
Yes.
prescription drug.
Transportation, Planning, and Environment. I know, that's, so the committee members, aside from myself as chair, is Larkin Eggleston, vice chair, Ed Driggs, Matt Newton, and Braxton Winston. And we got 3 really good updates when we met on January 27th regarding just some really very high-level important work that the planning department is doing along with CDOT and others. So the first one was the update on the comprehensive 2040 Comprehensive Vision Plan, which we look at as a shared vision for growth over the next 20 years. And what that plan is really doing is developing transformative strategies, using a lot of the plans that are already out there. And so sort of pulling those together, updating the ones that are outdated, and coming up with one comprehensive plan, hence the name. They are currently in the third phase of that plan, which is the policies and strategies phase. And then along with that, the discussion of the Unified Development Ordinance was brought into it, which consolidates all, as you know, consolidates all of our regulations into a single document. The Unified Development Plan really talks about how we grow, and the comprehensive plan is about where we grow. So that's sort of how those two go together. Let's see. Along with that, we got an update on a new app that hopefully will be introduced, and hopefully we'll have some funding forthcoming, which was really cool. We really enjoyed seeing the demonstration for what's called Arc Urban 3D Demo. And staff gave us a brief presentation and demonstration of the new technology that's being piloted, or has been piloted, by the Planning, Design, and Development Department. And it gives the ability to visualize and analyze developments much quicker by overlaying different data points on a particular site, well, site-by-site basis that beforehand would have given us months to do, and we didn't really have the visual to look at what it would look like. Arc Urban has the ability to look at specific projects and area plans throughout, as well as visual future development, and come up with different scenarios for development for an entire area. And so it compares development scenarios and communicate with effective communication for the user. And the program is subscription-based, as it has GIS capabilities, and it's a one-year financial commitment, which costs $30,000. And the committee was very excited to see if we could get that going as soon as possible, maybe not even wait till the next budget cycle. The second area that the third area, excuse me?
Just want to emphasize, these are 3D images, so it's really cool. They have all different shapes and building types, and you can sort of touch buttons and see different scenarios. And then there are data layers that provide other information about the area in which the new development, and it enables you to kind of extrapolate into traffic projections and other things. So I agree, it's a great planning tool, and I'd love to see us move ahead with it.
What's really cool is that if you have a development or developments in a certain area, it'll tell you how many jobs would be created, how many residential units would be there, and it really gives a cool impression, which is often what we're missing in our zoning presentations when we get things transactionally, and we're looking at one plan at a time, and we don't really understand the impact it might have on the broader area. So yes, to Mr. Drick's point, that this gives us that ability, which I think is just fantastic.
So it's basically like esports, it's like the Sims programs.
The what?
The Sims? Sims?
It's a little bit more high-tech than that.
Never mind, strike that from the record,
Once
Madam
again, we
Clerk.
have a little generational gap here, but have you heard of the Rolling Stones? Yes. The third area that we covered was the strategic mobility plan, and Ed McKinney from Transportation gave us an overview and a purpose of the role of the strategic mobility plan, which essentially will update and align mobility plans and policies to prioritize and achieve expected outcomes that were formulated in the 2040 comprehensive plan. And that would include pedestrian, cycling, Vision Zero, and all the other plans that we have in place for mobility. It will be integrated to identify and take care of the conflicts that come out of pulling all those plans together. And again, it is informed by the comprehensive vision plan and the UDO. So it essentially is going to make sure that we're aligning the policies and actions that are designed to connect all of this together. The reason it's important is that it will update and align. I think I went over all of that. So basically, that's sort of working on the goals that we've identified to shift to shift the culture of transportation away just from single occupancy car trips to different transportation modes, public transportation modes, and which along with that means that we have to reprioritize our investment and our support and, you know, where we're spending our money and how we're going to make those tough decisions on that to make it all happen. So with that, the next step is to define the scope, schedule, and deliverables in coordination with and integrated into the 2040 comprehensive plan and the various ongoing transit planning initiatives. The next meeting will be on February 24th. Thank you. Any questions?
Questions? Okay, we don't have any questions for all that hard work, so that's a good thing, right? Yeah. Okay, let's go to our Workforce and Business Development Group.
I got a theme song, Mayor, I got to play.
I know, but
Councilman Graham told me to.
Any shelter.
I got a condo with.
Okay.
you know.
Come on. Thank you for that selection. Okay. So the Workforce Business Development Committee, made up of Vice Chair Kari, Member Dimple Ashmere, Councilman Graham, Councilmember Johnson. And thank you, Victoria, for joining us, Councilmember Watley, on our first meeting on January the 6th. And to keep it very brief, Mayor and Council, we really focus on our 4 pillars: prospective business, great places, talent development, and business innovation. And you can see there on the board kind of the bullet points we cover. But let me make 2 comments that I think was very evident in our committee discussion. Is this committee is ready to move toward implementation and less about study and presentation. And I think over the last couple of years, we have not got the output we would like to get from this committee. So I'm still Councilman Graham, great quote. We need to put different kind of gasoline in the car in order to move faster. And so, City Manager, I would say this committee is very, very focused on implementation. So as we talk about items at our council at our ED meeting, at our committee meeting, we want to make sure that action items coming out from council for recommendation. Let me yield to my other committee members, see if other things you'd like to share. No, that's not me. So,
Okay.
Mayor and Council, any questions?
I do think that the comment around implementation is important. I think that all of us can admit to the fact that we've got really a low unemployment right now. And the idea of developing workforce talent quickly and giving training, but the thing that we've had incorporated was the guarantee of a job at the end of the training. Now, we have businesses coming to us saying, we've got more jobs, we can't find people in those jobs, and I think we need to be very nimble in terms of what we're doing in creating programs that quickly allow for competency training and jobs guaranteed at the end of that training. So I hope that the committee is going to work really hard on a framework that we could use for employers in the area to say, if you can come in and tell us this information and tell us how you can get people into those positions, and you will give them a job at the end of the training, then we ought to be implementing those as quickly as possible. And I think that that idea of this window is not going to last forever, so we need to push people that haven't had the opportunity to participate just because of the lack of training, because once they get training, they get on entranceway points or pathways, as we would say. So I would hope that. And then the other thing that I have heard the most about, and I'm not sure where it is here, but when we talk about small businesses. It's actually figuring out how our program expands beyond the inclusion program. All of us know that the city has a $2 billion plus budget. But when you take out the cost of people, you don't really have goods and services that could support any small business. It's not in the governmental sector that people make money. And so I'm wondering, at the same time, how do we actually create more opportunities that will allow businesses to grow? I said this a year ago. Wouldn't it be great if we had a minority contractor with a crane in the center city? And I know I didn't reply to the legislative group, but all of us know that a number of regulatory boards are created to make sure the inner circle works and not necessarily to open the doors for other people to come in. And so that can be all the way from the barbershop board to insurance and bonding boards. And I wonder if this committee could actually generate, not for the short term, but for our job creation, how do we actually open up opportunities that are locked out by regulatory efforts at the state level, or even at our own personal level? What are we doing to lock people out? And I always ask the question, what are we doing first, and then where do those obstacles stand for other places? I really believe that opportunity has to challenge the status quo in this situation. Insurance, bonding. I think then we can go to our partners in financing and say, are we really redlining businesses now instead of housing? So I hope that, I don't see that in here. A lot of us is about what we're doing, but government will never make a strong small business environment. It has to be the marketplace that does that. And I think we ought to figure out how we connect or take down barriers and create opportunities. So I have Mr. Winston and Mr. Driggs. Oh, okay, Mr. Winston.
So I agree with what you said, that the markets are going to have to, they're going to dictate the small business environment. However, I think we can play a role, and out of fear of getting to picking the wrong industry to concentrate on in a certain year, I'd be more interested if we can perhaps create a bigger umbrella goal that will give us the nimbleness to work within a certain focus area, month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year. So what if we were able to work on something, instead of just saying, let's connect these folks to these jobs by a certain time, we said something bold, like come up with a strategy so that everybody that by the time, when every 18-year-old in Charlotte, or everybody who is a graduating age from high school, is prepared to go to get a job, go to college or a higher level of education, whether that be a trade school, 2-year school, or 4-year institution, or go into the military, right? Create those pathways so that, again, we can be, if it's fintech this year or versus roofing next year, versus creating relationships with a certain campus or a certain school this year, it's always overarching and gives our body a clear kind of guidance on where, what role we do play, in creating that workforce and working year to year. And something that staff can always latch on to say, hey, it fits into this bucket and this is what we're doing, as opposed to picking and choosing, again, those specific areas of industry which we are never going to be optimally set up for.
Okay, Ms. Johnson?
So I thought Councilmember Braxton was going to go back to the CR IB or the Community Review Board or the CRB Board, because you asked, Mayor, how we as the city can take action to remove barriers for people. This is one of those practical examples. We just spoke a half an hour ago, or however long ago that was, about the, someone with a felony record not being eligible for a specific board. So if we consider leading the way in banning the box and no, right, but I mean, on that board, we had a whole discussion about a person with a felony is automatically, even if they're convicted, removed from the board. And I know that because of the dynamics of that board, but it's something that this is an opportunity for us to consider case-by-case basis. This is just one of those practical examples and how we have to think about that. And when we really want to remove barriers, or we talked about the Barber Board and the other board, we have an opportunity to do that ourselves. So it's just something to consider, how we're being inclusive. We have a great program project piece, but also at a very high level, we have an opportunity to make a difference and be more inclusive. That's all.
Well, I think that's a great point. If you're a felon, you cannot work in a bank. There are a lot more banking jobs out there. You can't work as a contractor. You can't be the plumber. You can't be the furniture installer. You can't do these things. And there are thousands of jobs in banking and finance, and that is the law. And I have made that point to many of the people at the federal level that, you have to lead the way. And so when we start talking about jobs and eligibility, and that's written into federal law. So we have a lot to do to think about this, but it seems to me that if you are going in to build or construct, and you can't do that. But reentry is a federal issue that I think has got state implications as well as local. I have to credit the sheriff of Mecklenburg County for doing a lot, and we need to do as much as we can. Mr. Bakari?
Yeah, and I've said this before, but I think it bears repeating. Taking it up a level, if we look back on the last several years of work, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to do a lot of different things, but thematically, there have been opportunities for us to seize a moment and make that the theme of the year. In 2018, as a group, we seized the moment, and it was a theme that year of affordable housing. In 2019, we seized a moment in the environment around us, and there was a theme of economic development and workforce recruitment and job recruiting. We have an opportunity right now to seize 2020 as the year of workforce development and be the glue that binds together all those last 2 years of things in a broader theme of upward mobility. But to the points already raised, that window is going to close. It is going to close very fast on us. And, it's just, back to the chair's point, it's going to be execution, it's going to be focus, and it's going to be all of us making it a priority, whether it's figuring out in a pilot mode how our business incentive grants connect to those coming here, and utilizing upward mobility job programs to fill their things, or it might be, looking at programs like Project Peace and MyApp and those things like that, and what the next version of them are. So I just want to reiterate, like, if we're spending extra time on something right now, right now, poised right before this budget cycle, the time to be spending it is on workforce, in my opinion.
Okay, so you've got lots of challenges, but I think we're completely up for it. Okay, I think that is our last committee. Oh, I'm sorry.
Last
okay.
on the agenda, but first in your hearts.
I know, but I thought yours was a separate agenda item. I'm sorry, am I getting off
No,
base?
It didn't. It's just
Okay.
the committee update.
Sorry, now we have intergovernmental. Sorry, I missed, I don't know which plan.
We're used to going last, Madam Mayor.
Which, I just didn't know which agenda, where it
Bringing up the rear of
landed.
the table, bringing up the rear of the
Okay,
meeting.
ready?
Ready.
All right, I guess I will begin. Your Intergovernmental Relations Committee, our committee members are myself and my co-chair, Tariq Bakari, as well as Larkin Eggleston, James Mitchell, and Mr. Matt Newton. We're going to split this up between Mr. Bakari and I'll start by just saying that we have met twice since the last strategy session on January 21st and January 27th. Before we go into the minutes of those meetings, just want to kind of give you an update about the approach that Mr. Bakari and I have kind of been taking towards this committee. We would like to figure out how to create a strategy that overall looks at putting an intergovernmental approach to all our decision-making on council, as it often comes up, whether it be in zoning, whether it comes to our approaches in dealing with violent crime. There seems to always be the need to reach out to other entities around other policy-making bodies. And so we want to talk amongst the committee, and we invite the input of the rest of council and the mayor's office for us to figure out a strategy of how we do that kind of seamlessly and constantly. In the meantime, Mr. Bakari and I have been setting meetings and having meetings with various folks from around decision-making bodies, either Mr. Bakari by himself, me by myself, or together. And since we've been put on this committee, we have met with the district attorney, school board members, the chair and intergovernmental chair, and we have a forthcoming meeting with the superintendent as well, several county commissioners, the public defender, the chief district court judge, legislators, and the local representation of the governor's office. We have a meeting with the sheriff upcoming. Happy to talk to anybody or answer any questions about some of the things, very interesting things that we've been learning in those meetings and possible collaboration areas. We also encourage, if there's anybody that our colleagues think we should be meeting with or points that you would like for us to bring up to different entities, to different bodies, please feel free to reach out to Mr. Bakari and I, and we shall do so.
So with that, I am going to quickly just give you a quick highlight of where we are in the current legislative agenda process, outline what has made it out of committee, and tell you about the dates to come. And you all have hopefully received some of this information. If not, we can go through it more. But on February 17th is the next Intergovernmental Relations Committee meeting. That is where we will have any final work referred to that committee, any discussions leading to February 24th, our second and final business meeting of this month, where we will have a council vote. This will be the formal vote that locks down the legislative agenda for this legislative year. I'm going to quickly just run through, and anyone who has questions, we can go back and have deeper items, the topic headers, so you all are aware of the federal and state legislative agenda items. For the federal one, you have an item on affordable housing. Again, a follow-on that we've seen is CDBG and the home items from the federal government that we constantly on an annual basis look at. Comprehensive immigration reform. You can see this is really based upon the work that Councilmember Eggleston and the committee and staff that went through the community in this last year. You see things like H-1B visas, asylum seekers, temporary protected status, and DACA arrivals. So a lot more specificity there in relation to what we learned in those committee meetings or those community meetings. Transportation and infrastructure, we have items on transit, airports, highway, and passenger rail, modernized and sustainable infrastructure, and then the UASI or Urban Area Security Initiative topics there. So there are 4 in that space. There are also 4 for the state legislative agenda: affordable housing, local control, minimum housing standards, and North Carolina search and rescue teams. You can read descriptions on there, and we can give anyone deeper items. These 4 on federal and 4 on state are the ones that made it out of last month's committee meeting and are now being proposed to be brought to us for final vote. What is not included in that list are several things that folks have brought up and either aren't ready or didn't make it out of committee. And I just want to kind of put on the record, one of those items is one of the ones I and several of you have been working on in comprehensive criminal justice reform. While I would very much like it to be on there, I think I self-recognize that we are not at the point with some of these things where putting it on the paper is conducive to the outcome we're looking for. But I don't want anyone to think that criminal justice reform is not one of our top priorities. We have a lot of detail. In front of me is a current draft of what we've been working on, detailing additional superior court judges, assignment processes, penalties for possession of firearm by felon, digital records, particularly in the DA's office and the courts. But these are very complex items that, again, haven't been polished enough and detailed enough in the strategies to be placed on this now, but things we are going to continue to work on from our parking lot and continue forth there. So with that, you know, I think we should probably just open it up for conversation and I'll let you close it out.
I
Councilman
think
Wilson.
we've had we had a pretty lively discussion both times in our committee about how we use our legislative agendas. Traditionally, we have only put on items that we think are able to be carried over the finish line in the occurring legislative session. But I have proposed, and especially around one item that did make it out of committee, advocating for more local control. I think we have a philosophical question about how do we use our legislative agenda. I propose that we use it to do any one of three things. Introduce a conversation that we know that is going to take a long time, but we want to bring it to the attention of our legislative body and start a conversation of how to get that thing passed. Keeping a conversation going, a representation of that in the past has been our desire to get subpoena power on the for the Citizens Review Board. One of the minimum housing standards item would also be a current occurrence of that came out of committee, and that more immediate, getting things over the finish line. So a short, long, and medium-term approach to our legislative agenda. I think that's going to be the conversation that we're going to have. For instance, I proposed this local control. I proposed putting the legalization of recreational marijuana on the table. Councilmember Ajmira put on this idea of source of income discrimination on the agenda. We think that might be something that might be better handled in committee, in the Great Neighborhoods Committee. Councilmember Watlington requested legislation addressing transportation funding requirements in her district. But again, that might be something that we might put in a parking lot or might have a longer strategy around. But again, these are discussions that I think we're going to have. Oh, yes, and Councilmember Mitchell suggested putting veterans under one of those protected groups when we think of disparities within hiring, like we do with our WMSBE programs right now. That would need enabling legislation to help us do that.
Mr. Drakes?
So I think we need to look carefully at what exactly the legislative agenda represents. And having been on that committee for some time, the people of Charlotte have the opportunity to vote for national representatives who decide national policy questions. They can make their opinions about it known. That is the channel through which they influence national policy. Similarly, at the state level, statewide policy decisions are made by people who are elected by their constituents to address those. They should be guided by input from those constituents on those issues. Our job in the legislative agenda is to communicate Charlotte's interests and therefore advocate for things like funding for transportation, which is something that immediately affects us. In fact, the things I have trouble with from what you just talked about is immigration policy is a national issue. Our situation here is not different from just about any other major city, and therefore we don't have any special standing on that. We have done a lot of work in our community, we're concerned about it, but that is something that our national legislators have got to decide based on input they get from their constituents at the national level. And on the state agenda, the municipalities, the League of Municipalities is working very hard in general on behalf of all municipalities in North Carolina to obtain specific authorities and to generally relax the control that the General Assembly exercises over us. But the fact is that our Constitution defines what kind of a state we are, and we act based on authorities we receive. Now, if we go to them and say, for example, we would like to have authority, say, on the source of income or whatever, and this is a priority for us. So then we go in, they think about whether that's a local bill, whether it's a state bill, how they respond to that. The difficulty with overstepping and getting too far out of our lane is you undermine the impact of the things that are really doable. So they'll register, okay, you know, you've got your opinion about immigration, great. We're not going to change the policy of the United States of America because Charlotte said these things about immigration. But we may change transportation funding based on input from people like us who look to that funding for very immediate needs that have to be met in our community. So I just hope that we will not kind of water down our message and undermine our effectiveness by coming up with topics on a legislative agenda that will be regarded by members of those other bodies as being their business and not ours.
A question for Mr. Driggs. One part of your sentence, you said it is not our job to advocate for changes to national policy, but then in the second part of the sentence, you said that it is actually our job to advocate for changes to national policy that you're comfortable with. So
That are specific to Charlotte. In other words, we have to identify why Charlotte in particular is approaching them on this topic and not just let our views be known on things that apply equally everywhere. So if we have a particular situation in Charlotte that we want to bring to their attention, our airport, for example, or whatever it is, we talk about that and they will understand that we have good reason to be approaching them about that. If we just go in and basically tell them how to do their jobs on subjects like immigration, again, we diminish our credibility with those guys by doing that.
I don't think anybody is suggesting that. I think part of this thinking about this new approach comes from last year, specifically around immigration, and that there was the fear that you expressed right here was expressed last year around this time, and there was other people on this body felt that. So we put it in a sort of an addendum, specifically around immigration reform when we went up to Washington. And then when we sat in those rooms, we approached this and we had that conversation. We had that with Republicans, we had that with Democrats, and we saw that, you know what, we had a bit of a constructive conversation. Those fears that we were putting out there, they were misinformed because they did not exist. It is our job. We are, while we do deal with direct policies, we are representatives of the people of Charlotte. We exist in a representative democracy. So people do give us the ability and the mandate to advocate on their behalf to different legislative and government entities and bodies. So that is our responsibility. Again, I think what we're saying is we should have a conversation as a council to figure out how we talk about these things in the most constructive way possible so that we can have successes in the short term but also in the long term.
Mr. Graham.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm very excited about the work of the committee. Braxton and his co-chairman brings a lot of energy to this committee, and I'm kind of partial to it, Madam Mayor and James, because we all knew how it was born. I got the scars to still prove it. So the mayor stopped talking to me for 6 months.
It wasn't me.
No, it wasn't you.
No, it wasn't me. Wait a minute, that's not good. No. That was a whole different mayor.
The other mayor, because he didn't want the committee. True story.
Right.
And we forced it through, and we got the committee passed, and the committee is doing good work. 2 comments, and then I'll give off the mic. One is, and we talked about this in the hallway today in reference to strategically working with Mecklenburg County and the DA about funding for the court system. We got to do that with a collective voice. We can't do it by ourselves. And we got to beat that drum home over and over and over again. As I've spoken with them, individually. Braxton's already been there. I mean, Bakari's already been there. And so the committee members are out there doing the work, and I appreciate that. And so I think we got to, anywhere where we can work with Mecklenburg County to speak with one voice, I think that's positive. I caution, however, on local control. You know, we got to make sure we understand the pieces on the chessboard. We got to make sure we understand the calendar, that come November, the pieces are going to look differently, maybe. And I think Ed is right in this point. I don't want all the good work of the committee to be lost, because when a legislator picks up our request, they're saying local control. That's just going to scare the hell out of them. And so I would just caution, if you're going to proceed, proceed with caution on that, because I don't want the baby to get washed out with everything else.
Just as a follow-up there, if I may, I mean, you're a former legislator, and you literally glanced for the first time at that piece of paper.
That's the first thing that popped, I looked at. I read the whole paper, and I stopped at bullet 2, because I understand the sensitivity of that. The mayor, the current mayor, over the last 2 years have done a great job of cleaning up a whole lot of mess up there, right? And so I think that in the current environment, it's not urban friendly, i.e. Charlotte, Greensboro, Wake.
Raleigh, yeah.
New Hanover County, Wilmington, Asheville. They all have something in common. I'll let you guys figure it out, what they have and what the makeup is, and why that is.
Yeah, well,
So I just.
and we completely understand. I think the 3 council members that
He's
voted
speaking,
that.
isn't he?
Well, I'll pause. It's
I think the 3
a friendly
council
conversation.
members that voted this out of committee understand that was myself, Mr. Newton, and Mr. Mitchell. I think I completely agree that part of this is about how you message this, right? Are we going to go up there and demand, say, hey, we want local control right now? You know, this is demand, and we're going to lobby. No, I don't think anybody is saying anything like this. Part of the discussion that happened, and I would also like to touch on the criminal justice portion that you pointed out there. The reality is that we as a city often run into roadblocks. We have issues, and we have solutions that are needed that are unique to any other part of this state. This state has never had a city of approaching 1 million people. This state has never had the need for a comprehensive public mass transit system. This state has never dealt with a city that is growing by a net 1,000 people a week. So if we want to continue, the continued growth of this city is important, not just for us, but for the rest of our state. Nowhere else in the state is there an airport that is representative of 4% of the total economic impact of this state. So as we move forward for the health of the state, we know that we need to take some of the reins off. So how can we, long-term, again, not coming out of this session, but how do we talk about this? How do we go to these legislatures and different legislators in different parts of the state? How do we engage different parts of the state, to say, okay, what can we do here, to do the things that works for Charlotte and Mecklenburg County that is also in your interests? And that's, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, fellow committee members, that's the way we talked about it, and that's what we are interested in exploring with the rest of our colleagues. As it pertains to criminal justice, I think this is exactly, again, kind of where we want to go. Got to sometimes step out of the box where we've been. I'll talk about my interaction with the public defender. I think Mr. Bakari will talk about our interaction with the district attorney. One of the things I learned is that our public defender is a state entity, but 33 staff members are paid for by the county. We used to pay for one of their staff members under a past city council. That was done out of CMPD. There was, when Chief Monroe took over, he eliminated that position. Talking to the public defender, he's in dire need of one more social worker, which could provide some of the restorative care that that 3 lawyers couldn't do. Maybe this is something that we consider moving forward. Mr. Bakari can talk a little bit more about what we learned
I
about.
have, wait,
let me
wait, wait,
make
wait, he hasn't finished.
One more
And then
comment,
I've
then
got two other people to
Then
speak
I'll be
as
quiet.
well.
I wish everybody in Raleigh was as thoughtful as you are. I really do.
Well, we have to control that, we have to.
No, I got the mic now, my turn. I wish they were. They all know those stats and figures. You recited about Charlotte, and they all know about Greensboro and Wake. It's not about the policy, it's about the politics. And I just want to make sure that we get the policy right, but we also get the politics right.
Well, we have to determine if we have a political agenda or we have a legislative agenda, because those might be two different things.
Okay, I know that we could debate this, but I have Mr. Eggleston and Ms. Watlington.
So just two things, and I don't want to belabor this conversation too much more, but two things. One, the immigration was brought up, and I think the litmus test for me is, are we being targeted in our approach of what we're asking for? And I think last year we weren't with immigration. I think we talked about it just as one topic, but we didn't have any specificity in our ask. Now, as Councilmember Bakari has outlined, we have some specificity there. I actually, even though it's one of my, and I think should be one of our top priorities, when the judicial system reform was brought up in the committee meeting, I said, I think that needs more specificity, and it is now getting that. So I think, too, with the local control, to the point about if we have certain things, like source of income, I think would be a great one for us to focus on. If we have certain things where we want to go and say, we believe we have a unique need for this specific authority, for this specific purpose, source of income being the perfect example, then I think we'll have a better chance of success, and we won't have the potential of people misinterpreting a broader ask as something that's more antagonistic than we might intend it to be. So I would hope that as we go into these things that we seek that specificity in our ask and not just broadly say things like immigration or judicial reform or local control. The other thing is, I will just philosophically disagree, and it can be a conversation for another day, that I don't see the legislative agenda as the opportunity to start a conversation. I think the opportunity to start a conversation is to have face-to-face meetings with specific legislators, starting with our delegation and then extending from there to find the natural allies for specific issues and figure out who our allies are, who the people are that we're going to be running up against as we pursue those goals, and build a coalition before we put something on our legislative agenda and kind of announce it as a priority to the world and open ourselves up for attack in that way. So to me, the start of the conversation leads to something getting on the agenda. Again, that can be a philosophical difference. I don't know that, I'm not asking you to agree with me. I just think that there's a different way to approach the beginning of the conversation to get to putting it on the agenda and having a chance of success.
Ms. Watlington, do you want to?
Yeah,
I think we can debate, but I want to make sure that she gets, can I hear, she has not spoken yet, and I think she would like to speak.
In light of the discussion that we've already had, and specifically what Councilmember Eggleston just said, I think that the piece that I do find most interesting, and I do think we should spend some time on just tactically, is understanding what does that look like before it gets to the legislative agenda. I'll leave it there.
I want to say that I think Mr. Winston and I can have this conversation in many ways in different forms, but there's a part of it when you talk about what is the tactical part of it, is that it's almost like on the legislative agenda, you've already gotten and reached some idea of what you were able to achieve. It may be a little bit of tweaking, but basically you kind of know where you're going to be able to go. And the conversation to get to that point on the legislative agenda starts way in advance of knowing who those decision makers are and who you're talking to. So for example, your transportation issues out in Steel Creek, there's a process that the state uses to designate. And so the question is, you don't get on that list as a high priority unless you know the criteria, and the criteria drives the list. And it's kind of like with anything else, the people that you're working with drive the success of whatever the agenda item is going to be. So there are different ways of approaching it, and the thing about Charlotte, I've always thought was good, is that our agendas have been really embraced by the county, We've actually had some ideas that we'd like, sometimes we disagree now. You know, we asked for a study committee on the tax exemption last year. They didn't go with it, but this year they're working with us this time. So it might take some time to get there, but you've got to start somewhere, and the question is, do you start at the decision makers that are at the end, or do you start building the coalitions to get you there, that you can have influence? Some of the most influential legislators on transportation live in Gaston County. And if we don't go over to Gaston County and have lunch with them and talk about how this impacts Gaston County and how it impacts the rest of the region, then we are not going to be able to get to that place. Now, it may be old school, but most of the legislators have worked under the system, and they would consider themselves successful. I think what Mr. Winston brings is a really different look at it, and a way that we can do something I think that at some point may have real opportunity. But we are here thinking in one area of methodology, and they are in another method of methodology. And so how do you mesh these things together, and when do you know that they'll work? That's really, for me, one of the keys.
Just one final comment, if I can.
Yes,
I'll be
of
quick.
course.
What I didn't hear in the presentation is you guys speaking with the local delegation, because that once you hand it off, it's their responsibility, and so I was just encouraged to have those meetings as well.
I did say that we have met with some legislators, and we'll continue to do so. Am I recognized? Sorry. One thing I will say, again, this is the position of the city of Charlotte, as Mr. Driggs said, and the only way to do that is to have a vote by the city council. Otherwise, we are just individuals that are going to have individual meetings and speaking on the behalf of our own priorities. And that is not, again, maybe that's a political agenda of individuals, or maybe we want to put a political agenda. But if we are saying we need things, there are things that we want to do, we don't have the tools to do those things, we know we will need enabling legislation at some point in time to do those, then we should say those things. And perhaps it's not beating down the House right now. I would say most of these things, given the political climate around what's going on up in Raleigh right now, probably not going to get done in the short session. But these are still our priorities. So we're already doing what I'm proposing. And I think I would, again, just think that we should codify this and be a little bold and figure out how to get people to change a little bit in their methodology, and don't be afraid to lead. We can use carrots here. I'm not suggesting that all we do is use sticks.
Madam Mayor,
Yes, Mr. Bakari.
if you don't mind, I think I can kind of close us out.
I would really appreciate it.
So I think what I would say in closing is, if you are unsure about any of the items that you've just heard, particularly the home rule approach, and I think you've seen one versus another, make sure to reach out, come to our committee meeting, talk to us before the vote, because deciding at that vote is not going to be helpful and healthy. And there are things that my co-chair and I disagree on. If you want to know his approach and reason for putting home rule there, go talk to him. If you want to know the opposite, come talk to me on that front or others. But on the same point, there are some things we both agree on, very vehemently so. One of which is, to Councilman Graham's point, we're going to work a lot with Dana on the process of this to make sure our delegation is completely armed and understands behind the scenes, informally and then formally, so they don't feel surprised, so they feel like they're part of this process with us. But then recognizing the current state up there, we've worked and built with a lot of relationships with people outside of our delegations that we want to also give respect to in this process to help with some of those lower hanging fruit items. And I think one thing that my co-chair and I both do agree on, and we've talked about several times, even today, when we meet with other folks, is it's still rebuilding of relationship time up there. We've done a lot, everyone's done a lot over the last 2 years, but our work is not done. And particularly looking across the state and saying, how can we not be known so much by the moniker of the great state of Mecklenburg, but by the ones who care that all boats rise? And whether it's looking at projects like the 74 corridor and showing our partners along there that we care and we believe autonomous trucking lines or whatever along there benefits everyone, or looking and maybe just looking back, and maybe, Mr. Manager, this is something you can work on with the state. You know, when we get a Honeywell, the J-digs that come from there, there's a 10% piece off the top that goes for rural projects. Why don't we showcase, when Charlotte gets a new headquarters, these are the types of projects that happened in rural areas, and then how do we grow that? How do we say, let's get creative and find ways to say, when we get a new tech company in rural areas, we deal with the broadband issue, things we know they care about. So I think I mentioned that to say, if we can do one thing really well, it's continuing to repair some of the bridges as we do this, and bridging the rural-urban divide, and continuing to do that and finding creative ways to do it. So we'll have disagreements and differences, but I think there are some things that we can all be united on, and I think we have the next month to solve all of that. So I appreciate everyone's feedback. Join us in the committee meeting on February 17th, I believe, and then in the second business meeting of the month, where we will decide finally what gets put on that agenda, or what we'll keep working on in the parking lot.
Okay. Anything else on intergovernmental? Before we adjourn, earlier in December, I announced that we would form 2 citizens committees. One was going to be on governance, and the other one was going to be on transportation. Well, transportation at the end of our retreat turned into mobility, which is an entirely different approach to the way that we look at this. And so we are continuing to work to pull together how we actually work around mobility, and we've gotten some ideas around people that would be willing to serve, but we have not been able to really effectively pull together what I think is a good charge that this council could believe in and work with. Based upon the feedback that we got at the retreat, we want to make it work. However, so what I said we would try to do in January didn't happen. Today is February the 3rd, and I want to say thank you to all that gave me some grace to be out last week with my family. It was truly a remarkable experience. If you haven't seen Gary McFadden do a eulogy, you have missed an opportunity. It's pretty amazing. However, aside from that, we also talked about a Citizens Advisory Committee on Governance. If you remember, 2 years ago, at the election, there was a discussion about council's terms, salaries, and a number of other things. And I made a commitment to several of you that we would have a committee like that, that would be a citizens committee that would work with that. We're still, again, confirming some membership, but I wanted to tell you that we have confirmed that we would have a Democratic and a Republican co-chair of that committee. Cindy Patterson has agreed to serve as a co-chair, along with Amy Peacock, who has also agreed to serve as a co-chair. The committee will have 11 members, and we'll try to get that out to everybody by Friday. Julie and I have been working on that. And thank you for those that submitted names. We're working from that list that we got for folks, as well as trying to do the balance politically as well as perspective between neighborhoods and corporate. But I did want to share with you that we have a charge, and the charge is that the Citizens Advisory Committee on Government is an ad hoc committee charged with detailed consideration of and recommendation to the City Council on the following issues: the mayor and city council terms of office, including length of terms, as well as a method of implementation for their recommendation. That the city mayor and city council should be full or part-time positions and the related compensation for those positions. And then the final thing that we committed to was that we would update our policy guidelines and principles for city council redistricting that will result that will be resulting from the 2020 census. Given the level of public interest in this issue, we want to make sure that the committee should have endeavored to complete its review and publicly release its recommendations at an appropriate time to allow ample opportunity for substantial public engagement and discourse for the potential voter ballot initiative if recommended in 2021. So that's where we're going, an 11-member committee, and the focus around council terms, status, full or part-time, compensation, and as well as our redistricting guidelines. Many of you know that we haven't done redistricting in over 10 years for the council districts, and the original rule was 10% balance of population between. And we don't know what those rules are going to be now, but we need to figure out in advance, instead of doing it in the urgent, to do it in advance with citizen participation. So that's why I think that we really have to be prepared for how we're going to do the redistricting, even though the council will do the actual drawing of maps, if you choose to do that. Or you could have a citizens committee, just like we've been talking about for other areas of the in state government. So I think that this will be a good start for us, and we'll get you a list of the committee members by the end of this week. Any questions or comments? Yes, Mr. Graham.
So could you tell me the timeline again?
Well, what we want to do is finish when we have the census data and the principles. If it's something that recommends a different method of implementation, it could be a lot earlier on the council. It depends, you know, the council can actually vote to change our own status. That's a timeline that's shorter, so we went with the longer timeline so that they would have a finished report if they go with the longest term of, if their recommendation requires the longer methodology for time. So we can actually say coming in, I would say that my disposition around that has been that if we're going to have a referendum, that we have to have public support for it, and we have to have people that are stepping out to make it happen if we go in that implementation method.
But the council can also make that decision.
The council could, they could be a recommendation for the council to make that decision. But longer to,
That decision being what?
The decision on whether or not to change the council terms.
But that could be overruled by a petition that could then put it on a referendum.
All of those rules apply.
But you're not saying that we would wait until we have the census information to, I mean, the committee
I'm
wouldn't
sorry.
necessarily have to wait until we have information about the census. We just want to do guidelines as to, because we won't have that information for 18 months. So guidelines for when that comes out would be part of the discussion.
Two different questions.
That's where I was getting to.
Right.
You were going with the census. I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about
One
who
is
makes the final
redistricting.
decision.
Yeah.
But redistricting, yes, we would do guiding principles, not the redistricting, until we had the data.
Gotcha.
But I think it better to have a conversation about how you do it without having the data in terms of guiding principles, not necessarily, you know, which precinct moves and which boundary changes.
Mayor?
And Mr. Winston, yes.
But I think Mr. Graham's initial question about the timeline still stands, because if the council is to have the full prerogative of deciding about those recommendations, especially when it comes to terms, we know that there is a calendar that we have to keep. So I think I asked Mr. Baker to inform us of what that calendar is, because if it does go to the referendum route, those meetings leading up to getting it on a referendum have to follow a certain guideline. So what are those dates? When do we need this committee to provide that recommendation by, in order to give council the full prerogative of making those choices?
I was suggesting that the furthest timeline would be 2021. If it's going to be that the council makes for the referendum. If the council wants to make the decision differently, you could have, if you want to listen to what the committee says and they come forward and say, you could do it in 2020, then there'd be a different timeline. But they will have all of that information from the attorney who will staff this committee to do that.
Yeah, I think, we need to give them a deadline, because council should have all the options on the table. And if we don't get certain things done by a certain time, we won't have all the options on the table.
But we don't, I mean, if there's a referendum, we probably cannot do it this year, right? Because we would have to have that work done by April.
Yeah, if you're talking about getting a committee together, get them
Yeah.
up and running, and then start the process, I think it would be, I'm not assuming that they would have their work done in time to where, let's say they wanted to go with a voter initiative.
If it went to, yeah.
But we started, so we've already taken part of the council's prerogative off the table.
Well, that's, I mean, it's the council's prerogative if we want to put
If
it
you want to put
to
it
a
on there,
referendum.
that's fine. If you want to do that, you could say that and go ahead and do that. I think that one of the questions that we've had is that the council has taken that kind of idea, and it hasn't been able to work because we haven't had citizens advocating and pushing and examining our choices. Now, if the council wants to take a prerogative and put it on for the 2020 year and do that in April, that would be up to them, up to you.
But we wouldn't have any data to work with
Well,
by April.
What my recommendation would be, so it could still have the potential of the best of both worlds, would be this committee's now coming together. And there, I think that, I like the approach and I applaud it. All we have to do is lay before them as one of their first orders of business, here is the hard and fast timeline.
Right.
So one, do you have time to go through and get it into this cycle? So literally, they say, all right, our first order of business in the month of half of February and March may be to get this information and say, can we make a decision by this? And if so, hand it to them in that cycle, and if not, so that way at least the option's there. But I think putting our own kind of, fabricated timelines on them when we want an answer, they have to tell us their timeline.
It's not
And it might be fast or.
It's not fabricated. We said that we were
unless-
going to do this process so that we can have all the options on the table. And we said this months ago. We said this before this calendar year.
Totally.
And now we're here and saying, actually, we're going to take some options off the table because
I wouldn't
of
say,
timing.
I wouldn't call it taking them off the
I would not agree that it's taking
table,
the option off the
as
table.
much as saying,
It
it's your
says-
prerogative, committee, to take as long as you need or as short as you need to come to the answer. I mean, It's-
They're
it's
not
a
going
fair
to want
group-
to take a long time to do it.
I don't think they
mean,
will either.
Nobody has the time to,
I mean,
so I would imagine it'll be a few months, but I don't see how they're going to, I don't want to be in a position of saying, we're absolutely going to do a referendum, because it is a fact that we could just decide to have our own vote. But if they decide that that's the recommendation, it's almost impossible to get it done to that point by this April. It would push it to the next April.
Even if we
it's a
do it
referendum.
by our own vote, we have to do it in a certain time frame that allows the citizens to have that check. We went through this. We know these timelines.
But we
I
have
guess
more
the
time.
challenge is, regardless of how we got here, we're here right now, right? And that's, I mean, so if, it's either one of two approaches. You either keep going with the committee approach and tell them that if you're going to go this route, time is of the essence, if you are, or just saying the committee's no longer relevant and having the votes.
Okay. So, all right, any other good before the order? Thank you very much. Do we have a motion to adjourn? All in favor? Aye. Aye. Okay, thank you.